Hi everyone, good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
Having made a will for a tramp, the rich man left his wife without an inheritance. And when his mistress got to know about it, that spring the weather was surprisingly sunny and warm. The rays of the sun getting into the building as if made the room brighter and cozier. But not the notary's office. At least on this day, the 15 relatives of the recently deceased banker were ready to destroy each other. It was well known to everyone that for many years he had managed to amass a considerable fortune, and everyone thought that it was he who would get the biggest part of the inheritance, as if confirming his right to claim the deceased's wealth. Those gathered took turns trying to remember exactly who he had been and something of their rare interactions with him. What was Gregory like as a child? A brightly colored lady wiped away a tear, and he and I used to play in the yard almost every day while our mothers sewed something, and they were third cousins, by the way. The man in the cap and time-faded jacket grinned and spoke angrily. You remember, you've never sent a birthday card yourself. Although I did not know him from the nappies, but for the last 15 years I have always sent congratulations on all holidays. And now everyone who sends birthday cards to rich people gets an inheritance, said with contempt the bald gentleman who came out and every minute wiped his head with a handkerchief. All these assembled in anticipation of the inheritance they believed was due. The company was entirely motley. Thus, unspokenly, they were divided into 3 groups. A well-groomed woman in black, wearing a strict suit and a small hat with a veil, sat aside at the window. Everyone was already aware that this was the main claimant to the banker's wealth, his wife Vivian. A young man of about 25 years of age was seated next to her, stroking the woman's arm soothingly and quietly, saying, "Don't worry, everything will be fine." It was clear to everyone without words that these 2 would be the first on the list of applicants for the will. The wife and son of the banker were well known throughout the city because they regularly appeared on the pages of the local press. The millionaire's wife attended all the boutique openings, festivals, and other glamorous events, and the son spent his parents' money in restaurants, now and then arranging debauches there. There were about 10 people who seemed to have seen each other for the first time, but each of them claimed to be a relative of Gregory who had left this world. They were the ones who were arguing about who, when, and how they had communicated with the deceased and who had more right to be thanked by him. The other 2 in this office were not talking to anyone at all. They sat in silence, watching what was going on. It was a young blonde woman in a small black dress that made her slim and even more attractive. Also sitting there was a man of indeterminate age in an old, rather shabby, but clean suit and a small check. The blonde came in later than the others and looked at the widow defiantly from the doorstep. She grabbed her son's hand and shouted defiantly and loudly, "Why has that creep come? Does she think that my husband will leave a will for a mistress? He had plenty of them." The bald man nervously wiped his head with a handkerchief and quietly said, "Well, knowing how he loved the weaker sex, I'm afraid that if all the mistresses turned up, there would be nothing to catch." The banker was indeed a womanizer, and the pages of the yellow press were full of pictures of him with another young lady. But, it seems, his wife at that moment, everything suited her. After all, she lived in her own pleasure, never working exclusively on her husband's money. Spouse, falling on her son's chest, the widow with all her appearance began to show that she was holding back sobs, although it looked completely implausible. The blonde silently walked to a free table and sat down quite calmly. All the so-called relatives stared at the stranger with disdain, and it seemed that at this moment each of them thought that it was she who could take away their benefits. But in a couple of minutes they all began to recollect again when and how long they had been in touch with the dead man, proving the importance of their relations with him. Only one hobo in a suit watched silently, as if he didn't understand what they were discussing. Several times one of the so-called relatives approached him to find out what exactly he was doing here. But the tramp only shrugged his shoulders in confusion and answered quietly. I don't know why the notary called me, phoned me, and said that I had to be present at the announcement. It was the banker's will. The brightly painted lady grinned. Well, it seems that our relative is completely out of his mind if he bequeathed something to his mistress and some beggar. Surprisingly, she was interrupted by a man in a cap. You know what, madam, it's not for you to judge Gregory's mental capacity. You see, you're not, I'm sorry, his own sister or mother, are you? Perhaps this chaos would have continued for a long time, but the door opened and a tall, gray-haired man in an obviously expensive suit entered the room, glancing around at everyone gathered. He said that he was a notary and was ready to announce the will of the deceased. There was such silence in the office that if the flies had already woken up on this spring day, one could have heard every flap of their wings. The notary once again looked carefully at everyone and, after a spectacular pause, began to read out the document in the folder opened on the table. And when he stopped talking, the room began to erupt into what seemed like a fight at any moment. The lady with the bright makeup screamed, "Where did you ever see a bum get all the money? And me, even if I'm a distant relative, to get a hand?" She was immediately supported by a bald gentleman. That's right, a bum and a mistress are entitled. And we, who once shared with the deceased in grief and joy, not a penny. Angrily waving his hand, he went to the exit, but the others were not going to disperse humbly. They, as if not realizing that it was impossible to change anything, continued to revolt, demanding justice. The banker had indeed divided everything in a very strange way. The wife got a cottage outside the city, the firm and plus one of the firm's flats to her son, and the mistress a spacious two-room flat in the center. A small sum was signed over to the man in the cap. Apparently there was something between him and the banker for which the latter wanted to thank him. But the last clause of the will, which said that all the funds in the accounts and securities go to no one else than a quietly standing aside tramp, caused a shock to everyone. "What a daddy," said the son indignantly, and looking angrily at his mother added, "And you kept saying that I was his kin. I was a stepson, and I still am. Probably would have written off everything to his kin." The banker's widow, sharply changed in her face, whispered, "What did you want? You were not going to study or work. How many times he offered you to study abroad and help in business?" The widow continued, "So all the girls and clubs were more important to you. All you could do was squander Gregory's money." Michael, that was the young man's name, was indeed not his own son. When Gregory married Vivian, the boy was 10 years old. But from the first day he treated the boy as his own. Except that Michael himself over time grew up and turned into a shameless dependent who did not want to hit his finger on a finger. All his days were scheduled, and in the plans were only meetings with friends and trips to clubs. Nothing else. The widow's remarks to her son were surprisingly interrupted by her mistress. "Stop that noise. Does it bother you at all that we got just some crumbs, and the whole lot went to this tramp? I don't know where he came from." She nodded towards the tramp in the worn jacket and continued, "Personally, I don't understand this situation at all, and I'm not going to put up with it." Everyone immediately turned towards the stranger, and he, not wanting, apparently, to escalate the situation, turned around and, without saying goodbye, quickly went out into the street. There was such hatred in the eyes of those present that it seemed they could tear anyone. But it was not clear to whom this hatred applied more, to the deceased or to the tramp who had received the lion's share of the inheritance. The stranger left, and the people gathered indignantly dispersed for some time. Already in the street, the blonde woman turned to the widow and said, "I don't know about you, but I'm not going to let this go. This tramp will regret that he did not voluntarily give up the wealth that fell on him. It should have gone to us, not that scoundrel, and we must find out where he came from at that moment. The women seemed to have forgotten their personal dislike for each other. What united them now was that they both felt they had been unfairly disadvantaged in the division of the inheritance, and they weren't about to give up so easily. In his heart, Michael was glad that he had got the firm. Gregory bought his stepson's flat a couple of years ago, spacious, with Italian furniture in perfect repair. But having no experience and knowledge in business management, the first thing Michael thought of was to sell the company. The very next day, Michael went to his late stepfather's office to see how much he could make from the business. How disappointed he was when one of the deputies, upon hearing his future plans, grinned sadly and said, "What are you talking about? The firm is on the verge of bankruptcy." Gregory, as soon as he learned that he was ill and would soon die, completely abandoned the business. In fact, let everything go on its own, and in our business you need strict control at all stages. During his illness, many employees, feeling the approaching collapse, resigned, so we have to start almost from scratch. I can, of course, stay on for a while and help you in memory of my father, but you need to invest a lot of money to get the business back on track. Michael was shocked by what he had learned and didn't know what to do next. Of course, he didn't have the necessary funds for development, and it was impossible to sell this sinking ship. He once again hated the tramp, who had obviously got a lot of money and was ready to strangle him with his own hands. At the same time, in a small room in the semi-basement of the lodging house, the tramp was looking at a document with the number of the safe deposit box. Jerome, that was the stranger's name, sat there in disbelief. It all seemed to him like a fiction, a dream. In all his 30-odd years of life, no one had ever given him anything, much less bequeathed it to him. Therefore, he could not fully realize what had happened. The only thing that Jerome understood from the notary was that right today he could go to the bank specified in the will and get a decent amount of money. After a bit of thinking, he went into the big box that replaced his wardrobe and rummaged through his things for a long time. Finally, he found a more or less decent jacket and jeans. It was probably the only thing he could show up at the bank in. At least it seemed that way to Jerome. After quickly changing his clothes and taking the document he had obtained at the notary's office, he went there. The guard at the entrance at first squeamishly examined the entrant and then stepped towards him, saying loudly, "Man, you must have the wrong door. They don't feed you here and they don't give you a living." Jerome, taking out his documents from his inside pocket, timidly said, "I need a director. I'm your client now, and I'd like to get my money." The guard ran his eyes over the presented document in surprise and, turning to his partner, said, "Jen, take him to the manager. I'll alert the secretary." Jerome went up the marble stairs of the bank and once again could not believe that all this was not a dream and was happening to him. A young secretary was already waiting for him in the reception area, and after looking at him from head to toe, she looked questioningly at the guard. The latter, shrugging his shoulders, said, "The orders were to let him through and escort him out. So I did." The girl opened the office door and, entering first, asked, "Daniel, security's here to see you," said to let an important client through. A hoarse voice said something in reply, and the secretary invited Jerome in, then went out and closed the door. Behind the massive desk sat a full gentleman with a red, fleshy face. Jerome was greatly surprised. For some reason, he had expected to see a sporty, trim man, necessarily perfectly dressed in an expensive suit. And that was exactly what he had imagined the bank manager to be. This was the exact opposite. And what's more, the man was clearly hungover. The fat man took a few sips of mineral water from his glass and said unhappily, "Excuse me, I'm very busy. Could you please state your question quickly? Security reported that you are a client of our bank." What can I do for you?" He took another few greedy sips of the liquid, and Jerome thought at that moment that this was the only person who didn't seem to care how or what he was wearing. Jerome stepped to the desk, held out a copy of the will, and said he would like to withdraw half of the amount owed to him. The fat man reread the document, glancing at Jerome incredulously several times and checking his passport. His eyes glittered feverishly. In one gulp he drained the glass, and changing his tone, immediately said good-naturedly, "A pity, a great pity about Gregory. He was a fine man. It's a shame, isn't it? It's strange that the accounts have gone to you and not to your son or wife. Are you a close relative of the deceased?" Without waiting for an answer, he continued excitedly, "Why don't you sit down? Of course, we don't care what you spend your wealth on, but I think we might be able to give you some guidance in these matters. After all, as I understand, you are a newcomer and have not dealt with such sums before, and money should be managed properly." The manager was silent, and as if he was immersed in his own, judging by his face, unhappy thoughts. Jerome could not even think that at that very moment the fat man was thinking how he could make a deal with this tramp in order to win. After all, he needed the money that day. The manager was an inveterate gambler, and the previous night he had lost a considerable sum in an underground establishment. And that was the reason, as usual in such cases, to get drunk right there and then, which now gave him a terrible headache. But despite this, he decided to persuade the client to keep the money. After all, it was his duty to attract new clients, and not to lose those who had kept their capital with them for years. Not yet understanding why, he began to stall and persuade Jerome. "Why take so much at once? You, my dear fellow, have just received your inheritance. Wait, you must get used to the idea that you're rich now. The money will be safe in our bank for the time being, and how will you decide what to spend it on? Welcome. But where are you going with it now, not to bury it in the ground like in the old days?" He tried to laugh at his bad joke, but it obviously didn't work. It was evident that communication was difficult, and he would have been more pleased to improve his health with a drink of something strong than to talk to a tramp. Jerome decided to spare him such agony, and in a confident voice he said, "Please, let's stop this conversation. I, of course, have never had such money, but I already have a clear idea of what I will spend it on. Don't worry, I'll take only half of the money left to me, and the rest will stay in your bank," said Jerome. He really knew what to spend the money on. Since childhood, Jerome had loved animals, especially dogs. So he decided that the first thing he would do was to build a shelter for homeless animals. But he decided not to tell the fat man about it. He was sure that a man like Jerome could not understand him and would take him for a madman. The manager tried once again to stop him, but in the end he was forced to give out part of the deposit. As soon as the door closed behind Jerome, he grabbed the phone and dialed the number with a trembling hand. "Kareem, a man who looks like a vagrant just left my place," the fat man said in a rapid, almost rapid-fire voice. "We need to go and follow him discreetly, where this jerk lives, or where he's going now, and report everything to me." Having hung up the phone, he poured the rest of the mineral water into a glass with a trembling hand and, having drunk it in one gulp, collapsed into the armchair. For a minute, blissfully closing his eyes, he sat there, and then suddenly he grabbed the phone again and, flipping through his notebook, dialed the number. There was no answer for a long time, but as soon as it was answered, the manager spoke in an ingratiating tone. "Michael, hello, it's Daniel. We crossed paths at the club. I heard about your father. I'm sorry for your loss. He was a good man. Saved me a couple of times, lent me money to pay off my losses. I'm so sorry about Gregory. It's a real shame." He stopped abruptly, apparently listening to his interlocutor, and then continued. Yes, I know how difficult this is for you. I'm actually shocked by Gregory's will. but there's nothing I can do about it. It's his will. But I wanted to tell you the lucky beneficiary was here today and withdrew half the money. Maybe you'll be interested in that in the near future. I'll know where he went after the bank and maybe even where he lives. Yes, I will be ready to give you this information for a symbolic fee. I named the desired amount. The fat man listened to Michael in silence and promised to call him back as soon as his man returned. Finishing the conversation, he smiled smugly. It's better this way. We'll process this one now, he said aloud and, humming something under his breath, sat down at his computer. Whether it was thoughts of future money or from the huge amount of mineral water he had drunk, but his condition was much better, and he was ready to finally get to work. But just 5 minutes later, he received a phone call. Having quickly written down something on a piece of paper, he, without saying anything, dropped the calling number. He immediately dialed another number. When he heard the answer, he spoke. As promised, I'm ready to give you the address of the newly rich man. I'm sorry, but I'm waiting for a transfer to this phone number first. At the other end, apparently something began to say something indignantly, but the fat man, slightly removed the receiver, said loudly, Michael, we're grown-up business people. So, as they say, money in the morning, chairs in the evening. I've been waiting 5 minutes, I'm sorry. I've got a lot on my plate. And as soon as the promised amount is in my account, I'll send you the exact address of this tramp. As he hung up the phone, the manager nervously tapped his pencil on his desk. He kept his eyes on the telephone. When he heard the sound of a message, he smiled and immediately typed a new message to Jerome. At that moment, he had another plan in his mind, which he decided to implement that very day, calling Kareem to him. The manager locked the office from the inside and explained something to him for a long time. He was sure that Michael, having received the address of the tramp, would go there, and he was not mistaken cursing the insolent manager. Michael at that moment drank 2 shots of cognac in a row and called the waiter, paid. He came to this cafe immediately after going to his stepfather's office and with a wild desire to get drunk. The reason for this was, as it turned out, the collapsing, not prosperous business and life injustice. Having been deprived of his much-desired bank account, now having been given the address of the insolent man who had become heir to what should have been his, Michael decided to go and deal with the tramp by hailing a taxi. 20 minutes later, he was standing in front of the 2-story barrack, and after looking round the squalid structure, he went in search of the right room. Approaching the semblance of a front door, Michael said to the plywood scientist, taking hold of the handle, "Hello," and pushed it open. Immediately, the door quietly opened inward. The place he found himself in wasn't very large. 2 huge nails were hammered into the wall by the door, probably instead of hangers, and some things were hanging on them. The daylight hardly penetrated the room. The window was very small and somewhere below the ceiling, which made the room seem gloomy and damp. The only furniture in the room was a bed made of wooden sticks, a shabby table with paint splatters, and a single stool on which the tramp sat. There was a metal mug of hot tea on the table in front of him, and a long loaf in his hand. Michael looked at it squeamishly and said with a chuckle, "I never thought that the heir to such money lives in a shanty town and eats a loaf with some bologna. For your stepfather's money you could eat black caviar with spoons and drink expensive cognac." When he noticed a small black bag on the table, he staggered towards it. Jerome, obviously not expecting guests, had not had time to put it away after his return from the bank, and it was in it that he had brought the withdrawn sum. He stood up abruptly and took the bag off the table and set it beside him. Michael grinned and said angrily, "Look, where did you come from? Everything was supposed to go to me and only me. Do you realize it's not yours? You'd better give it to me nicely." To which Jerome calmly replied, "It's not for us to decide. It was the dead man's will. So the money is mine now." The guest's patience ran out at once, and he staggered towards his host, saying, "I will beat you now, so that you will beg me to take it all back, and I will first beat your face slowly and surely." He had already made a clenched fist when he found himself lying on the floor with his hand behind his back. Jerome was clearly enunciating the words. 2 hours a week in the gym is not enough time to think you're the master of the world. You know what Special Forces is? Maybe you've heard of it. I spent 2 years there bleeding and sweating. I wouldn't advise you to continue our conversation in such a tone. And you, sir, better go home and sleep it off. Taking Michael by the shoulders with both hands, he sharply put him on his feet. "Where's the door, remember? Good luck." Returning to the table, he sat down on a chair and had already taken a mug in his hands, when the guest from the doorway shouted, "Yes, I'll destroy you. You bring me that money yourself on a tray. You'll see." Jerome rose sharply from his chair, but the furious major had already left, slamming the door. That evening, the owner of the wealth that had fallen from the sky could not sleep for a long time. And it was not even in the appearance with a scandal Michael, but in the fact that he himself was trying to understand what had happened. But by morning, Jerome calmed down and already clearly decided that the next day he would start to find out what was necessary to open the orphanage. In the morning, he went to all the authorities, then looked for a place for the pets to live, and came back in the evening, tired, but very satisfied with the work he had done. Everything was working out just fine. In a week or two, he could be the owner of a small shelter for homeless animals. Jerome decided to have dinner and go to bed early so that the next day he could finish all the necessary paperwork. In the morning, he got up in high spirits and hastily brewed himself a cup of coffee, drinking it without breakfast. He was about to leave. When there was a knock at the door, Jerome thought it was Michael again, but he dismissed the thought. Surely he wouldn't behave so decently, and he would have burst in without knocking and opened the door like last time. He was surprised. On the threshold stood 2 men, one of whom, taking his ID out of his pocket, said they were police officers. He reported. "Early last morning, Michael's body was found in the archway outside your house. The lad has a head injury and is in intensive care." A second authority spokesman added, "We have interviewed residents and several people said he was coming out of your driveway, and an upstairs neighbor says you had some sort of scandal that evening. We have already found out that you had grounds, because you suddenly inherited what should have legally gone to this young man. Get yourselves together. We must detain you until the circumstances are clarified." Jerome tried to justify himself. "Yes, we had a fight, but I would never do such a thing in my life. Do I have an alibi or witnesses?" "Who can confirm that you didn't follow him?" asked one of the policemen, and, without waiting for an answer, added, "Pack up. We're waiting for you. We're going to the station." Jerome thought about what had happened. He didn't understand who would want to attack Michael, but somehow he was sure that it was all connected with the inheritance. During the interrogation, he tried to remember all the details and tell everything to the investigator, hoping that he would be able to understand the case. Jerome realized that he had been set up. But who had done it? He knew neither the spouse nor the mistresses of the deceased, who wanted to get the inheritance, certainly would not dare to do such a thing, and no one else came to his mind. At the end of the interrogation, the young investigator said, "I will of course look into everything, but I must say, the victim's mother is determined and said she would make every effort to bring the case to court." Once in the detention center, Jerome couldn't stop thinking about who had benefited from the attack and who else would want to eliminate him by taking him into custody. But nothing good came to his mind. Realizing that it would be virtually impossible to prove his innocence, he almost resigned himself to the fact that he would have to serve time. That all changed one day when the cell door opened and he was told that he had a visitor. Jerome was surprised, of course, but he had no idea who he would see there. Standing before him was the same mistress of the deceased whom he had seen at the notary's office, wearing a delicate pink trouser suit and high heels. She was even more beautiful than she had been that day at the notary's office. Her blonde curls fell over her shoulders. Her face was covered with a minimum of makeup, and Jerome stood staring at her beauty. The girl grinned. "Well, what are you up to? We don't have much time, so I'll get straight to the point. I know you're being accused of something you didn't do, and I have evidence on who is really guilty of what happened. But you realize I'm not just going to hand it over." Jerome sat down opposite and continued to stare at his interlocutor. She said, "I am ready even now to give everything I have, and the guilty will be put in jail, but you, of course, will be released. But you see, nothing in life happens for nothing. You give me everything Gregory bequeathed you, and I'll give the investigator the dirt." Jerome thought for a while, but he answered, "I agree. You know, freedom is more precious than any riches." Grinning sadly, he added, "All the more so. I didn't even have time to smell that money. As they say, if you haven't lived richly, there's no reason to start. I think such a pretty girl will need this dowry more." Looking at the blonde, he realized that she was not ready for such a turn. No, she might have believed it, but that Jerome would refuse so quickly certainly did not expect. But then she pulled herself together and said, "Well, that's fine. But you know, I need a guarantee, a receipt, or a power of attorney of some kind. And as they say, go on, Henry." He smiled. "Not Henry, Jerome, but you're a savior. What's your name?" But the blonde silently pulled a sheet and pen from her small purse, placing them on the table in front of Jerome. He wrote, she prompted, dictated, and when he finished, she reread it. Then she smiled. "Good boy, no fool. You'd be more decent, not a tramp. Maybe she'd even fall in love." Already approaching the door, she turned round and, smiling, said, "By the way, my name is Lauren. Good luck." Jerome waved picturesquely. She left, and when he was in the cell, he realized that he really liked the girl. At the notary's office, he had no time for that. He had been confused, so he hadn't been paying attention to anything. And now, when she came to him in the detention center, the rest of the day Jerome only thought about her. But at some point he realized that nothing could be between them, forbade himself to think about the blonde. To say that he immediately believed that, having received the money, she would bring the matter to an end. Jerome couldn't believe it. But Lauren did hand over some, apparently material from the cameras to the investigators, and the next day he was free. If only he could have known that this particular hottie had a hand in his imprisonment. Lauren, as promised when leaving the notary's office, didn't leave the case alone. She couldn't bear to see some half-bum become rich. Annie, who had possessed the banker's data of late, left nothing to it, having reported to the bank almost immediately after Jerome. Annie, who knew the manager's weakness for money, suggested to him a very favorable plan. It was simply to take the money from the tramp by any means necessary, and then divide it between the two. And it was the fat man who told her that he had given Michael the address of the newly made heir, and that he had been drinking a lot and was probably going there at that moment. Together they thought out everything to the last detail, and in a few hours the hired scoundrels caught up Michael and beat him up. Everything else went according to plan, and after getting a power of attorney from Jerome, they split everything in half the same day. But Jerome didn't know anything about it, and when he was released, he was glad that he wouldn't have to spend the next few years behind bars. As he approached the door of his home, he saw a small shaggy lump right on the threshold. It turned out to be a puppy of a completely unknown breed, black in color with white spots on its chest and legs. He looked frightened with his little button eyes, begging Jerome not to leave him. "Poor fellow, where did you come from? And how long have you been sitting here? Hungry, I suppose." Saying this, he lifted the baby in his arms and carried him home to the trough where he usually washed. Jerome himself found a tin of stew on the windowsill and, opening it, said, Well, Black, that's our supper for tonight. Come on, join us. And at night, Jerome slept as if he had fallen into a dreamless pit until morning. And the baby snuggled against his legs and only occasionally sighed, as if reliving his feelings and problems. In the morning, Jerome woke up and was glad to be free. And probably even more so that now he had nothing to do with this crazy family, deciding that everything was in the past. Jerome started to get ready to go again, looking for some temporary part-time work, which he had existed before he got his inheritance. He helped unload cars at the market, cleaned the supermarket grounds for a small fee, and it was just enough for the essentials. After patting Black behind the ear, he was about to leave when there was a knock at the door. After the police had knocked on his door the same way this morning, he didn't expect anything good to come of such a knock. As he approached the door, Jerome stood for a second and pulled it open. He couldn't believe his eyes. Michael's mother stood on the doorstep, the same widow who had been at the reading of the will. Seeing his surprised face, Mrs. Elizabeth said quietly, "Hello, may I come in? I really need to talk to you." Jerome took a step back, letting her pass, and suddenly quickly took his jacket off the nail and laid it on a chair, inviting his guest to sit down. She looked round the poor dwelling fearfully and looked at Jerome, but sat down, deciding that she, too, wanted the money he had inherited. He decided to make it clear at once, and seating himself on a plastic crate that stood against the wall, said defiantly, "If you're after your husband's $1 million, I don't have it anymore." His mistress turned out to be nimble, and is probably already somewhere on the sea spending what she got in exchange for my freedom. I gave her everything. The woman looked up at him, her eyes full of tears, and he realized that that was not what she had come for. As a lump rose in her throat, she spoke softly. "When my husband was alive, he solved every problem. My son and I lived without any problems, without any troubles or worries, but now he's gone. My son is in a coma. I am all alone, and there is no one to help me. My friends are like, if you've got money, they're there for you. If there's no money, they're gone. My son needs expensive treatment, then recovery. Of course, I have some money, but it's running out like water. I didn't come here to ask for money. I already know that bitch Laurent took it from you." Standing up, she went to Jerome, who was sitting silent, and with a pleading tone in her voice, she begged, "I'm begging you to take over the firm. Well, at least until Michael will not recover. After all, we are our own people. I do not know for what reason, but the same heir as me and my son." Jerome was shocked at the suggestion. "Do you think you're saying I'm the one to run the business? I've never done anything like that in my life. I have a secondary education specialized, and here finances, transactions, something else there." She, as if trying to calm him down, started talking again. "It's nothing complicated, nothing. The firm has been around for years. You just look after the cogs of this machine, which is already working on the beaten track. You just have to feel a man's hand there. So I want you to be that hand." The widow was so sincere that Jerome felt sorry for her. She seemed unhappy and confused, and he promised to think about it, and the next day he agreed. Mrs. Elizabeth was glad of the decision. She managed to get it all over to Jerome very quickly, and he had no idea at that moment what kind of bondage he was getting into. He was so open, so trusting, that life didn't seem to have taught him anything. Once again he believed, not suspecting that the widow had already thought of everything in advance. She had made such an offer for a reason. Having learnt that the company is on the verge of bankruptcy and up to her ears in debt, the woman decided to switch it all to the hated tramp. On the first day, finding himself in a half-empty office, Jerome learnt all, from the same Deputy Gregory, the real picture of affairs. It was only then that he realized what he had agreed to get himself into. All day he sat in his office, poring over some papers and documents on his desk, understanding nothing about them. He didn't know what to do with all this, how to proceed. His thoughts were interrupted by a quiet voice. "Excuse me, can I clean your place?" Looking up, Jerome saw a young, pretty girl of about 25 with a bucket and a mop in her hands. He nodded and, rising from his chair, caught a stack of some documents, which immediately scattered on the floor. The cleaning lady dropped her equipment and began to help him pick up the papers. After a glimpse of a few sheets, she suddenly said, "You know, these contracts need to be renegotiated. They're flawed and therefore inherently unprofitable for the company." Jerome raised his eyes to her and looked at her carefully, asking, "How do you know? Do you work it out?" He motioned for her to sit down and they chatted for a very long time. Jerome learned that her name was Catherine. It turned out that the girl had a degree in economics, but because of once made a rash mistake could not find a job in her specialty. "My former manager offered me to become his mistress," she said sadly. "And when I refused, he framed me, forged a signature on a document. It all ended with a suspended sentence. With such a stigma, as you understand, no one takes a job. So I have to be a cleaner. I've got a little boy, Nicholas." Not expecting himself, Jerome suddenly asked, "What about your husband? Doesn't he work?" She grinned and said quietly, "Husband, as they say, is full of pears. I've been divorced for over 2 years now. I don't even know where this scoundrel is. He's never once come to see his son. Speaking of you, I overheard a conversation. I won't say whose, I'm sorry. Well, they're trying to set you up with all the debts of this office. But if you'll excuse me, when I'm done cleaning, I can take a look. Maybe there's something else I can fix." Well, it can't be that such a well-known company in the whole region so easily and quickly collapsed. Jerome took her hand and said with a smile, "Yes, you, Catherine. It seems to me God himself sent me. How could I be against it? I even thank you for it. Help me." And she really got to work. They sat up till almost midnight, going over the papers. When the clock struck 1:30, Jerome said, "Catherine, that's enough for today. Let me walk you out. My son must have missed his mum by now. Tomorrow, if you don't mind, I'll be waiting for you here again. We have a chance to save the firm." Catherine smiled and said, "There's always a chance. The main thing is to know how to use it. Mrs. Vivian, the pensioner who lives next door, is helping me with my son. I phoned her. Everything's fine. She agreed to babysit while I'm in the office and put him to bed." From that day on, Jerome ran the company, or rather Catherine did. But nominally he was the director, no matter how hard it was. But she had time to fulfill her direct duties, clean the office, and all the documents to review, and with her son to deal with. Jerome was amazed at how much strength and energy this fragile woman had. He realized that if it wasn't for her, the company would have collapsed, and was very grateful for the help. Catherine in a short time managed to review all the contracts already concluded, and what could be changed or corrected changed. But that wasn't all. She found new profitable clients and helped Jerome to conclude several deals that gave the firm a chance for a second breath. Slowly, employees who had quit began to return. And after Gregory's death, the firm began to pick up again. All this time, despite the problems that fell on him, Jerome did not forget that he really wanted to know the reason why the late businessman left him an inheritance. It was obviously for a reason. And perhaps he was a relative of Gregory's in some way. But did I know my kin? He was about 2 years old when he went to the orphanage, and all the way through the army. It was his only family of origin. Some of the nannies said that he was thrown under the door, and some said that his parents were killed in an accident. And after that he was placed in an orphanage. But he never knew the whole truth. After a little bit of sorting things out, Jerome was still going to go to the orphanage, where he grew up, and try to find out the truth. At the first attempt, nothing came out. No one wanted to talk, but Jerome felt that the director was not telling him something. He had been told from the time he lived there that the headmistress had a taste for money and would take bribes at any opportunity. He went there again the next day. When she saw the envelope in Jerome's hands, she quickly became talkative and told him everything she knew. It turned out that Jerome was Gregory's own son. He had actually had his wife killed in an accident many years ago. Gregory was just developing as a businessman, and his competitors were giving him a hard time. There were constant threats, demands to sell the firm. And Gregory, terrified for his child's life, decided to give him to an orphanage. It was too late for Jerome to find out. I wanted to ask why he did not take him away when everything became calm. But alas, there was no one to ask. It came as a shock to Jerome. It turned out that all these years he lived in the same city with his own father without even knowing it. When Jerome left the orphanage, the carers had tears flowing. He had dreamed all the years since he was a child that he would have his own people, his mom and dad. And now, learning there was a father, he couldn't contain his emotions. Jerome had only seen Gregory in a portrait with a mourning ribbon in his office. But on this night, he dreamed of him as if he were alive. His father begged his forgiveness, begged him not to abandon his life's work, to save the firm. Waking up in the morning, Jerome gave himself a promise to do everything in his power to avoid bankruptcy and bring the company to the next level. The black dog that ran up, as if approving his thoughts, barked merrily and wagging his tail, curled up at his feet. "Well, little one, don't worry, everything will be fine. Soon we'll move with you to a normal house, and you'll live like a noble dog, Bones." "Goodies," Jerome said. Indeed, as soon as the firm's business got better, he began to look for a place to rent and finally move out of this shack. The business, thanks to Catherine's help, began to return to its former successful level. The staff was great, and everyone took the changes from the new manager surprisingly well. Jerome watched Catherine work hard for a while, and one day, taking her by the hand, he said, "Now then, I've made up my mind. Such a bright head should not be lost cleaning the office. You're a real professional, and that's why I'm appointing you CFO from today. I hope you don't mind." The previous CFO never returned, although he had received calls offering him a job. "So, Catherine, your office is now across the door from mine, please." "No, I even demand that you go and settle in right now," Jerome said. Catherine looked at him confused and as if afraid to move. Jerome, seeing her condition, put his arm around her shoulders and quietly said, "What's the matter with you? You deserve it. Let's celebrate your appointment tonight at a cafe. I hope you can ask your neighbor to be with Nicholas." The evening went splendidly. Jerome found a quiet, cozy establishment and they had a wonderful time there, talking about completely different topics. It was so easy for the two of them, as if they had known each other all their lives. When they left the cafe, Jerome suddenly stopped and pulled Catherine to himself, kissed her. For about 5 minutes they stood embraced, and both of them absolutely did not want to part. "Let's walk a little more," Jerome suggested in a whisper, and Catherine agreed. Holding hands, they walked along the seafront. They wandered for an hour, gazing at the stars and the water. It was there that Jerome decided that he wanted to fall asleep and wake up with Catherine every day. But it was clear that there was no way he could bring her to his current place. After seeing her home that evening, he decided to take care of the housing issue the very next day. A day later, when he looked into her office, he said cryptically, "Catherine, I want to take you to lunch. I want to show you something. I hope you don't mind." When they entered the spacious two-bedroom just across the street from the office, nicely renovated and furnished, he put his arm around her and quietly asked, "Do you like it, Catherine? I've found a small but cozy nest. I want you and Nicholas to move in with me." She smiled happily. "Let's give it a try." A few days later, as they were loading Catherine and her son's belongings into the car, the very neighbor who had been looking after the boy came over. And with tears in her eyes, the neighbor said, "Oh, what am I going to do without you now? Nicholas is like a grandson to me." Jerome approached his grandmother and, smiling, said, "So Catherine and I are going to another city. If you don't mind, until we get Nicholas into daycare, you can keep an eye on him. I'll send a car for you in the morning. And of course we'll take you back too, and will you and Nicholas stay with us? Well, play here, read to him. What else? And we'll pay you a salary like a nanny. Unless, of course, you ask for $1 million." Jerome laughed with a wink. And the grandmother, immediately frightened, replied, "What's the matter with you? What money? I tell you, Nicholas is like a grandchild to me." "Well, that's fine," Jerome said with a look at Catherine. "So tomorrow morning at about 8 o'clock a driver will come to pick you up." Jerome was himself surprised at how easily he was now able to enjoy the benefits he was entitled to. The company was doing very well, and he could afford a rented but good apartment, a company car with a driver. But most importantly, he was happy with Catherine and had quickly found common ground with Nicholas. Now he had somewhere to go and wanted to go home. Catherine turned out to be a wonderful hostess, very tasty cooked, trying to spoil them almost every day with some goodies. Life seemed to be getting better. Jerome gradually began to get into all the affairs of the company, and he even found it very interesting. During the whole time, he only once remembered about those, thanks to whom he got this business. And that was only because Mrs. Elizabeth herself showed up at the office. Honestly, I never understood why she was there. Well, okay, I saw a look of annoyance or regret on her face. She clearly didn't expect to see a fully functioning company and a full staff. After sitting for half an hour or so, Mrs. Elizabeth tried to complain about life, telling me how hard it was for her son and her without a livelihood. Then suddenly she said, "Michael, as soon as he regained consciousness, remembered that the bank manager who gave your address was literally half an hour afterwards finding out where Michael was. There's a reason for that. I think he was the one who ordered my son to the gangsters," Mrs. Elizabeth said. "Have you reported this to the police?" Jerome asked. "You need to make sure you tell them all of this. If anything is required of me, I am willing to testify or help. Be sure to tell everything to the coroner." As he saw the widow off, he didn't even realize that the whole inheritance story didn't end there. Some time later, he was indeed called for questioning, but already as a victim. It turned out that Michael still wrote a statement. He told everything he remembered, and his bank manager was taken into custody. The fat man turned out to be a coward, ratted out everyone involved in the case. The investigation went on for a long time and was quite high profile. The manager of a well-known financial institution in the city turned out to be a common bandit. Laurent managed to somehow get out of it and, as they say, got off with a slight fright, unlike the fat man, who with all his accomplices went to jail. All the funds stolen from the account bequeathed to Jerome were returned. Not thinking long, he made a decision half will keep to buy his own home and business development, and the other half immediately transferred to the account opened for Michael. Jerome told him about it right in the hospital, where he came to tell him who he was and why he got such a large inheritance. Upon hearing this, Michael said quite calmly, "So, now you're like a brother to me. I've dreamed of having an older brother all my life." They both smiled and agreed that they would never fight again, no matter what happened. From that moment on, surprisingly, Michael went on the mend rather quickly. And a month later, when he was discharged, Jerome said sternly, "I'll give you 2 weeks to recover, and I'll see you back at the office. You'll be working for me. Daniel is going somewhere else in another city to live. There you'll be my new deputy," Jerome said. From Michael's happy face, he immediately realized that he wouldn't refuse and began to gradually bring him up to speed. When Michael went to work, Jerome breathed a sigh of relief. Well, now that I have such a reliable cover, I can safely take care of my personal life. Walking over to Catherine, who was sitting at her laptop, he pulled a small velvet box out of his pocket. "Catherine, will you be my wife? I love you and Nicholas very much, and I want to be with you always." She stood up, put her arms around his neck, and said quietly, "I love you too. And I agree. After all, our son or daughter should definitely have a daddy." Pulling away for a second, Jerome looked at her with loving eyes and grabbed her in his arms and whirled her around the office. "Hey, hello. Am I disturbing you?" Laughing, Michael watched the scene. "Are you inviting me to the wedding?" said Michael. Setting his favorite on the table, he turned round and replied cheerfully, "You what? You're going to be the most important person after us at this celebration. You're going to go as a witness." A month later, in the same cozy cafe, where not so long ago first sat Jerome and Catherine, the wedding was celebrated. The newlyweds, smiling happily, kissed under the shouts of bitterly of the guests and accepted congratulations. Nicholas, not yet understanding anything, sat in the arms of his favorite nanny and clapped his hands joyfully. Mrs. Elizabeth, rubbing in her hands the ribbon of the witness on the stage, whispered and asked, "When are you getting married, Michael? It's time for me to babysit my grandchildren, too." Hearing this, Jerome decided to intercede. He's going to have a good time until he meets the one he really loves. And if you want grandchildren, you can come and babysit for us. We'll soon have 2 little ones who need love and attention. Suddenly, Nicholas jumped into the conversation. "We also have a dog called Black. He needs to be walked. That's what Daddy says." Everyone laughed, and Jerome gently pressed Catherine against him. "I'm the luckiest man in the world," he whispered. Then, pausing and catching the moment before anyone was paying attention to them, he said, "I've also decided to give you a wedding present. Yesterday you got your suspended criminal record expunged. Turns out there's a great lawyer who managed to prove pretty quickly that you're innocent. So now you have nothing to be embarrassed or afraid of. But I hope you won't quit." Having learnt this, Catherine, barely holding back her tears, happily dissolved into the arms of her spouse.
"How long can you sit on my neck?" Husband freaked out. Why did she do it in the first place? I don't know. She wasn't old. She wasn't exactly a hag. Another thing is that he, her spoiled, crazy husband, needed a young one. The concept of young for Tom was clear. If a girl did not marry before 21 years old, then she is too old and something wrong with her. Don't ask me why 21st century medieval attitudes. It happens. And Kelly, 36, is a childless grandmother. It's like Tom's forgotten the time when he thought of his wife as his greatest treasure. Spoiled her, bought her everything she wanted, not even for her, but for him, dragging her around the country from job to job. And then she became a suitcase without a handle. It happened without either of them noticing. She was 18 when they got married. He was 10 years older. She was pretty, in the style of actresses of the 50s, short stature, delicate face, big eyes. He's the most ordinary. You wouldn't immediately remember what he looked like unless they said his name. It seemed to Kelly that Tom had not just fallen in love with her, but clung to her like a tick. He couldn't let anyone else have her. After walking her home in the evening, he wouldn't dare leave the entrance for another hour or two until he saw the lights go out and the windows darken. Surely he was afraid that before Kelly went to bed, someone else might come in and take her away. There was no question about the seriousness of his intentions. He'd proposed to her within a week of meeting her. Tom cared less about the wedding itself, the restaurant, the guests, the honeymoon. Can we do it with or without him? All he cared about was getting married and taking Kelly with him. In the meantime, Tom had quit his job again and was moving up north. Kelly's father kept silent, only sighed, resigned to his fate. And her mother cried she didn't want her only daughter to go so far away. Kelly herself had no time to think about it. Registry office on a weekday, without any celebration. Some hastily organized home parties, and now the train. A rainy evening, and the carriage slowly begins to sail away from the platform. There in the new place, Tom rented a flat, waiting for the time when they would have their own. No carriages, dormitories, or the like that his new mates were content with. It wasn't so much that he was chasing comfort as he wanted to keep Kelly away from any encounters, even casual ones. She was to sit in that 9th floor flat like Rapunzel in the tower, seeing no one but her husband. When Tom was free, they'd go on nature trips. Kelly appreciated the beauty of the north, those pewter, brass, silver colors of the short summer, the still water mesmerizing. The rest of the time she was entertained by books. She'd signed up at the library. And serials, those endless ones where at the beginning of the series the characters start making themselves coffee and then finish the cup at the end. Serials that you could do all your housework to. Tom was a blob of energy, and that's what he took the others by. Charming seemed not at the expense of appearance or intelligence, but because of this vitality, which many lack. In certain cases, if there was no one brighter, he could become the soul of the company. He was always and everywhere regarded by his superiors as indispensable. He really was a jack of all trades. And when he got bored in one place and broke off to go to the other side of the country, it was always regretted by the bosses and those with whom Anatoly worked, and the women with whom he managed to get acquainted and who envied Kelly. "You're not a military man," Kelly said to her husband, "but I feel like an officer's wife always traveling over the road." Tom had always had money. He would never work for an idea. And now, to comfort and cheer up his wife, he floods her with presents. In the wardrobe, racks of dresses, blouses, and suits hung as tightly as if they were in a shop. Kelly could match the outfits with shoes of the right color. And the saying, "a well-to-do woman is one who doesn't wear ripped tights under her trousers," certainly applied to Kelly. He wouldn't let her work. It was out of the question. "We've got enough money," Tom said. "Nothing to go where you can find adventures on your tail." And he didn't want kids for a long time, maybe 10 years. Whether it was the settled, beautiful home life, with quiet evenings, cleanliness and freedom to dispose of his time that was more precious to him, or whether he was subconsciously afraid that he would be jealous of Kelly, even of a child. When they finally settled down in a large regional city, their own flat was bought. Tom became a small boss. It turned out that Kelly could not get pregnant and give birth in any way. But this was not the main reason why her husband's attitude to her changed. She simply remained as she was, pretty, but no longer young. But young, quiet, not entering into arguments, and so predictable. He'd had enough of the bland. What did he want? The first time he said it was an accident. It wasn't worth mentioning. He forgot it immediately. "You're sitting on my neck." Kelly threw her head back. That phrase clawed at her heart. Those words, casually dropped, are always the most sincere. Tom didn't pursue the subject. He was still putting together the wardrobe she'd bought, but his face was absent. In his thoughts, he lived somewhere else. It wasn't long before she realized he had another. He had a crush on a girl the same age Kelly had been when they met. The age difference seemed so vast to Kelly that a connection couldn't be in her mind. It would look both ridiculous and laughable. Naive Daisy. Tom's passion was named Jane, and she was the complete opposite of his wife. An athletic girl with long, strong runner's legs and hair dyed bright pink. And she had so many things, like intricate patterns on her long, sharp toenails, piercings in every possible place, intricate tattoos that Jane could be looked at for a long time, like a painting or a puzzle. However, Jane didn't make men puzzle for long. She gave up quickly, if the price was right. All this Kelly had learned in roundabout ways. The big city wasn't really that big. There was only one thing that bothered Tom, but it was the most important thing for her. Jane was not averse to making money wherever she had a chance. The concept of fidelity did not fit in the head of the pink Malvina. She was flying. You want to let her go and keep her at the same time. To let her go, so as not to suffer and not to be tormented by jealousy, to keep her, because without her, no way. Without Malvina, life seemed long, empty and boring, like a gray canvas that stretches to the horizon. His wife became annoying, because she was that very cloth smooth, predictable, without a single bump. You could walk on it with your eyes closed and never stumble. Tom was tired even of Kelly's cuteness, which was beginning to show. If there was a reason to fight, a thunderstorm broke out. A consonant word for a tiff, they'd break everything that could be broken, from dishes to relationships. Maybe he'd feel better. But Kelly didn't go for the provocation. She stood over the cooker, slow-cooking borscht sacred. The smell of meat, garlic, parsley, and satiety. If satiety can have an odor. Even if you swear you eat such borscht and you feel happy. Tom overcame himself and decided to hurry things up. He had a wide circle of acquaintances, including a pimp. No, not the film boy who arrives in a nice car to herd girls on the red light street. Michael was a subtle personality. Either a pimp or a procurer. He could order a girl, a boy, a waistcoat to cry into all night. Michael was also a pro. He could unmistakably determine who was worth what, and who to offer whom. Sometimes he did things that were completely unexpected, but he was never wrong. He knew that this young blonde, with the appearance of a model, can get sick of his partner in an evening. But that woman over there, which seems to be nothing special, will be carried in his arms for a long time. Tom saw Michael several times a year in companies of a certain kind, and always by chance. The next meeting was just as casual, but suddenly Tom had a thought that struck him as brilliant. Maybe he'd just had too much to drink. "Listen, can't you put my wife on the case?" he said. Michael had seen a lot of things in his life, perhaps too much, but here he was dumbfounded. Yes, among his clientele were married women who sometimes wanted a thrill and who would not mind going left. Almost all of them wanted their cheating to remain a secret, except for one totally promiscuous couple who were looking for another equally promiscuous couple. Michael tried to advise the casual acquaintance to go wake up, but the same life experience told him that it would be a good idea to look at this spouse with his own eyes. You never know. They made an appointment. Tom didn't tell Kelly who Michael was. Maybe she wouldn't be right for him, and then they'd have to say goodbye to the tempting idea. He couldn't just leave Kelly at the railway station on a corner somewhere to find her own clients. It would be easier to just kick her out. Divorce her. Michael came to visit, as if he were just an acquaintance. Kelly served the men coffee. She baked a pie with apples and set the table, moving, as always, silently and without uttering unnecessary words. She tried not to interfere with the conversation, present but not involved and not noticing that Michael was watching her. Tom also cast glances at his wife, but not satisfied. Kelly had not dressed up as he had asked. She remained in a simple homemade dress, blue with a ruffle, her hair gathered in a ponytail. She was an actress. Now she was a Ryazan woman. Who needs such a woman? Every man's got one of those. Michael didn't stay long. Tom went out to escort him up the stairs. He was sure that Michael would reject the goods, but he said vaguely, "We'll see." And that was the end of it. 3 weeks later, he called out of the blue and asked Tom for Kelly's phone number. "What do you want?" Tom became wary. Michael was silent for a few moments. "I don't understand what this shifty man wants in the end. To compete with him, to sell his wife himself. Flag in hand and a steamroller to go with it." But Michael indeed had an extraordinary case. So he clarified. "I think your Kelly would be good for one person, for a conversation." "What do you mean, a conversation?" "He has circumstances. I won't go into details, none of your business, sorry, but this man will be at the restaurant late tonight. He'll be drinking a lot, and he'll probably want someone to be there for him. You listen to what he says, or just keep silent with him. I answer with my head, no one will hurt your wife." "Huh?" Tom's got it. "Then Kelly's fine. When it comes to keeping quiet, she's the best. So give me her phone number, dummy. Because you and I are getting a film, the groom agrees, the relatives agree, and the bride has to be persuaded." In relations with women, if it was necessary, Michael knew how not to press, but to achieve his goal by persuasion found the way to the heart. Tom hesitated a moment, and the phone dictated. Later he would discuss these piquant details with Malvina, and she would complain that there would be no one to take pictures of the secret meeting. If there was dirt on anyone, she would be even more submissive. When he got the number he was looking for, the pimp called immediately. "Kelly," he said. "Do you remember me?" "It's Michael, I was visiting you. I have a huge favor to ask of you, don't take it for granted." The woman didn't answer, but Michael realized she wasn't speaking because she was confused. "Come to this restaurant tonight. I'll introduce you to a man who cannot be left alone. Believe me, it's very important. You'll save your soul." "You should see a psychiatrist," Kelly said and hung up. Then she went about her usual business, And somewhere in the back of her mind, like a spring that had suddenly broken through, she was filled with the thought that it was not for nothing, that it was Tom who had thought up and organized everything. Both Michael and the meeting to which she had now been called. It made her want to cry. Kelly suddenly realized that she hadn't cried for a long, long time. Maybe she hadn't even learned how. You could shed tears if you felt sorry for yourself, but she was too tired to comfort herself. Tom didn't want to look ahead to see a routine life, an impending old age. Kelly was afraid to look back. She could see herself standing there in that kerchief, with the dust rag. The years were behind her when she'd gone from princess to Cinderella, and the prince had degenerated and wouldn't divorce her. Kelly felt like getting drunk. She called Michael back. "Okay, I'll go," she said. It was a hotel restaurant, fancy and so expensive that Kelly was embarrassed to even walk past it. The carpeting there was already outside, and there were vases of orchids at the entrance. Kelly hadn't bought clothes in a long time. She'd stayed in that other life, with her husband blowing dust off her. And now Kelly didn't know what to wear. If all she had to do was talk, this dark blue jacket would do. She could match it with the pale blue silk dress she had once loved so much. The silk was real, delicate, not weighty. But there was hardly any cosmetics at home, and perfume only Grasshopper Bridge, with its heavy, clingy odor. Kelly was ready for Michael to send her back, to call some young girl for his client. She was even more embarrassed that she had come first. She walked around the entrance for a while, hesitant to stop lest she be chased away. There must be someone like a doorman. He'd be out in a minute. "Why are you standing here? You can't linger here." A black car pulled up. Very inconspicuous, Michael the pimp didn't like too much attention. He got out with the businesslike look of a man who comes to this hotel almost every day. He recognized Kelly immediately. He nodded, didn't say anything about her appearance, but as if he was grateful that she had agreed to this venture at all, and was standing here in person, not late. He took her politely under the elbow, and they went inside. The restaurant was in a semi-basement. Kelly was far from all that. She was much more comfortable with unsophisticated dumplings and pie shops. She would have felt out of place, even if she'd just come here with friends. Now she was tense, looking around, even though she didn't know who was waiting for her. Michael knew. The dim lights, the heavy wooden tables, the bar. For some reason it all reminded Kelly of an old sailing ship, a caravel being carried along by the waves of life. Michael took Kelly to the corner farthest from the entrance, the one with the least light. Here sat the man they needed, or who needed them. A dark-haired, middle-aged man with a thin, nervous face. Kelly noticed there was a hat lying next to him. Who wore hats nowadays? The glass of wine was almost finished. "Miss Kelly," introduced Michael's companion, and Kelly threw him a surprised look. How did he know her middle name? "She'll sit with you as long as you want." Michael understood, but he didn't answer her question. "He'll give the name himself if he wants to. Well, I'll leave you to it." The man nodded carelessly. He was immersed in his own thoughts. Another similar nod to Kelly for her to sit down. She sat down with a straight back. There were hardly any customers in the restaurant. Only at one other table, a group of men engrossed in conversation. A young bartender behind the counter, in a white shirt and black waistcoat, and a waitress who approached them almost immediately. A dyed blonde in her mid-40s. She had a tired look. "Order whatever you want," the man said to Kelly, nodding at the menu. What food could she think of right now? She was feverish with excitement. A glance at her was enough to realize that. "Bring us some for now." Kelly didn't know what the mysterious-sounding words meant, but she guessed they meant wine or something stronger, and an appetizer of some kind. There was silence in the air as they waited for the waitress. "What should I call you anyway?" Kelly asked. And after a while, "Are you sick?" He was definitely awake. There was confusion in his voice. "What makes you think that?" She shrugged her shoulders. "Nothing else occurred to me. Only that you have learnt that you are ill with some terrible, hopeless disease and have no one to talk to. And I'm now a traveling companion who won't see you tomorrow, so it's okay. You will indeed, one of these days, hear of my death," he said tiredly and calmly, as if it were a done deal. "But it is of no consequence." He took her hand, but there was nothing sensual in the movement, nothing of the kind. He held her wrist. "Here you are, you need to check your heart. Remind me when you leave. I'll text you the number and you call. You're a doctor. She suddenly remembered him. Yes, he was a doctor, a very famous one. The kind of doctor they always say was from God, from God. She remembered his name, James, but his middle name was lost somewhere. Then I realized. What do you want to put your hands on yourself? Others will do it for me. But how? Are you being threatened? She didn't understand. Maybe some crazy patients he didn't cure. You can't save everyone. But if you know, why don't you leave? Why don't you run away from them? They'll get you everywhere. There's nothing you can do about it. But I can still live today. There was a momentary flash of rage in his voice. Exactly. He tried to argue with fate for a moment. The waitress brought the wine. James signaled for her to leave. She came back with another tray, set out the plates of appetizers, and finally left them alone. What do they want with you? Kelly asked. What for anyway? He was silent for a moment, then said, as if he hadn't heard her, as if he were talking to himself. I've had quite a lot of time, after all. Life could have been shorter and much more precious, so there's not much to repent or regret. But behind it all was a little boy who was desperately scared. And Kelly realized that. She touched his hand too, but not in the way he had done before. She just covered his hand with hers, letting him know that she felt his fear, and she felt sorry for him. Do you have anyone? Kelly asked, and anticipating that he wouldn't understand her question or would misunderstand it, she clarified, my mom, my sister, someone in the family. Can't you go to them? He shook his head. I have relatives, but they are far away in Siberia. We haven't been in touch for a long time. It's just that life has separated us. But I wouldn't go to them anyway. You can't set them up. She took a few sips of this insanely expensive wine, which didn't seem to taste like anything special, but it made her head swim gently. And despite the oddly tragic note of the conversation, a sense of flight and recklessness came. It's a good thing you have someone at all, she said. I miss it all so much now, my childhood, my grandmother, whom I would hug now, her old house. It's a former merchant's house. It had such thick walls, such wide windowsills, and many, many geraniums. I even remember the feeling of it sitting on the windowsill, knees tucked up, a ray of sunlight falling on your face so that you squeeze your eyes shut, and the smell of geraniums. Everything was so safe and solid then, and it seemed like it would always be that way. Kelly noticed that the memories of his childhood seemed to bring him out of his stupor from the world where he was now. James was distracted, herself, in her most difficult, infinitely difficult moments. It had been a lifesaver. Thinking back to the distant years was like diving to great depths. Everything appears a little unreal, a little blurred. It makes my ears pop, but the rest of what I want to think about ceases to exist. So they sat there, reminiscing about their childhood, each of them his own. It didn't matter how interesting and coherent the story turned out to be. What mattered was that you wrap yourself in that memory like a warm blanket. James was talking about a stream that ran through the park in their town, which went into a mysterious black pipe to make films, that's all, and then flowed into a pond, where in summer the boys caught small fish, the size of a little finger, and in winter they skated. And you could clear the snow with a mitten, look through the ice, as if into an aquarium at the algae, at the green beads of cassava, at the still frog, which also looked at you eye to eye. Come on, I'll walk you back to your room, Kelly said at last. The hour was such that it was time for the restaurant to close as well. She could sense from herself that it would be hard for her to stand on her feet. And how would he feel? He'd started drinking before she got there. But if they leaned on each other, they'd make it. He remembered his number was 211. But when they stopped in front of the door, he gave the key to Kelly, not sure he could get into the keyhole. There were mirrors and orchids in here too. Orchid pots were everywhere in this hotel, and there was glass and metal all around, also shiny, cold, reflecting you 1,333 times. James put his arm around Kelly and stood, swaying slightly. She was precisely the one person he was related to that was so hard for him to tear himself away from. An inexplicable feeling came over her as she pressed herself against his chest. They just stood there, neither moving. And still, just yesterday, Kelly wouldn't have imagined for herself that such a thing was possible. She was reminded of the boy Ben she'd known since she was a little girl. He lived in their backyard. Only she'd been very young then, about 4 or 5 years old. and he was already graduating from high school. A handsome red-haired boy, her first love, which she hid from everyone, even from her mom. Then they saw each other many years later. He became a helicopter pilot, went to Afghanistan, fought in battles, got married. His Mia was a very sick person, a severe diabetic, and everything was repeatedly complicated by her carelessness. She could forget to give an injection on time, and he trembled when he rushed home after work. What would he catch? Would everything be safe there? He didn't look like his old self anymore, heavy, gray-haired. But Kelly had a wonderful feeling every time she found herself in his company. The cliched expression, like being behind a stone wall, was the most accurate. Protection, calmness, confidence in her own safety, and the fact that he would not let anything bad happen would shield her from everything. Of course, they remembered each other, talked about their childhood. And Kelly admitted to no one that she often envied Mia's diabetes. And now James was the second one to come her way. It couldn't be explained in words. He was in some desperate bind from which he saw no hope of getting out, and she was beside him, feeling the peace she'd only had as a child, and she couldn't find the strength to pull away, to say goodbye, to walk away. It was the one moment of her life that if you didn't appreciate, if you didn't give up everything else for it, you'd always regret missing. Kelly closed her eyes and took a short, convulsive breath. In the morning, she started to hurriedly pack, but he told her, "Kelly, sit down." His tone was different now, as if the momentary weakness he had allowed himself yesterday had passed. Now he spoke to her as an elder, as one to be obeyed. "What I'm going to tell you now, you must listen calmly." Kelly sat down. She didn't look at James, averting her eyes. This night felt like it had been stolen from her. She didn't feel worthy of this man. What had Tom insinuated to her over the past few years aged, faded, bland, unwanted? There's no such thing as an unattractive woman. There's no such thing as too little vodka. Well, last night's wine had been enough to make her pass for a sensual beauty. But it's daytime, sunshine in her wrinkled, unmade face. "I'll give you some money," James said. And before she could take offense and resent that it was payment for the night, he continued. "You're going to have to change your life very soon. You're going to have to do it. Believe me, I know. If I turn out to be wrong, you can toss that money in the Mississippi, give it to charity. But I'm giving it to you now so that when the time comes, you can walk away and start over. Do you understand me?" She didn't realize how much money he was talking about until he opened her purse and dropped in 3 wads of $5,000 banknotes in a banker's girdle. Kelly gasped, "Are you crazy? I'm not taking it for anything." "Luba, I don't need that money anymore," he said, separating each word from the other. "That's what I wanted somewhere in some fund. You can do it for me later." But she was so shocked by what was happening that she let the words pass her ears. "Will you give me your phone number?" she asked as she walked away, resigned to the weight of her purse. "Sure," he dictated the number. "Have you calmed down?" His face didn't flinch. "Yes." "Will I see you again?" He pulled her to him again and stroked her hair for a long time. And now she was sure that even if they never met again, this bond would remain between them forever. The house was empty, Tom at work, the usual mess that reigned whenever her husband stayed home for even a few hours without her, the dirty dishes in the kitchen. Kelly walked slowly through her flat, as if it were someone else's. Would Tom ask her when he returned if she'd had anything with this stranger from the hotel, or just a conversation, as the pimp had promised? And probably her husband had arranged with the lawyer for some sum of money to be received for her. In the evening, Tom asked no questions. He took the lid off the pot and inhaled the smell of chicken soup with a look of bliss on his face. Pouring himself a deep bowl, still steaming, he sat down and began to eat. Kelly walked out of the kitchen. Another day passed, another. James didn't call her, nor did she call him. But Kelly had no doubt he would make himself known. People like that don't lie, don't dodge, don't disappear, don't sneak out of other people's lives in haste like thieves. On Saturday, before having coffee, Tom went down to the ground floor and picked up the mail. Yes, they still subscribed to a few newspapers, and, for Kelly, an indoor plant magazine in Archaism, but there it was. Kelly herself didn't know why she picked up the local paper, unfolded it, and saw his portrait. A famous doctor. Tragic death. Burnt body found in the woods. All his regalia was listed: born, graduated from the institute, worked, taught. The funeral will be today. They say fainting can be avoided. Kelly remembered something like that. It is only in films and books heroines beautifully and smoothly sink to the floor, and the heroes rush to bring their feelings. Kelly's friend had fainted once. In a very unfortunate way, she had fallen and knocked out her front teeth. Kelly herself was now dizzy, and a black veil was thickening in front of her eyes. She fumbled for a trestle, sat down, and just breathed deeply for a while, concentrating on that. When she felt better and realized she could stand up, Kelly said to her husband, "I need to go to the funeral." She couldn't see his face, but she could clearly picture the way he raised his eyebrows. "Whose are these? Do you know him?" She couldn't remember if she had a black dress. What did it matter, though? James was being buried from that farewell hall in the medical center. Kelly had never seen so many people come before, and she never would again. The small hall couldn't hold everyone, and people were standing outside. Someone tried to go inside, but a young woman wearing a mourning bandage on her head came out. She was tall, not grief in her eyes, but defiance, a desire to stand up for herself. "Wait here. There's no room for relatives there, it's stuffy. What do you care? The coffin is closed anyway." Someone whispered that it was Alicia, the seventh water on the Sour Patch, the sister-in-law of a cousin, and sighed disapprovingly. "Why hurt people? It's a common grief." And indeed, crying without hiding. Very young girls crying old people. These were James's former patients. Those whom he saved pulled out, came out. A unique, absolutely unique doctor. There would be no more like him. He could see right through a person, look at them, touch them, and realize what had happened to you. And they'll never find the people who killed him. That's how it always happens. If such a unique person is taken away from us, no one will be responsible. When the crowd began to move, and they carried wreaths and heavy lacquered coffin, when they started to get into buses, there were not enough standing places. And there was a cavalcade of cars and young guys on motorbikes, bikers. They were patients, too. Kelly didn't even try to join anyone, to ask to get into a car, to squeeze onto a bus, to stand on the steps. She leaned against a birch tree and cried, covering her face with her hands. She cried even after everyone had left. It was somehow unnoticeable. Kelly spoke to Tom now as if he were a stranger. Everyone lived their own lives, and in the evenings Kelly sat in the rocking chair by the window for a long time. She had her knitting on her lap, but she did not touch the needles and was deep in thought. About 3 weeks later, Tom said to her, "I found you another client." Kelly didn't immediately realize what he was saying. She looked at her husband exactly as he said the phrase in a language she didn't know. "Well, they gave me such good money for you that time," he explained. "Now Michael is offering more." Yeah, Kelly said automatically. James knew everything in advance. "You'll see I'm right." Kelly found nothing better than to hide the money he gave her inside the piano. There they waited for their time, and it had come. Now it had to be decided where to go. Pack her things and disappear from the house right after her husband left for work, so he'd keep her out of her hair longer. No, of course she'd leave him a note, explain that he didn't need to look for her. Maybe he'd even be glad, and a pink Malvina would take up residence in their flat tomorrow. Kelly didn't care about that. She knew she wouldn't go to her parents' house, because there, if her husband wanted to look for her, he'd find her immediately. And she needed to get away from everyone and start, as James had told her to do, with a clean slate. She was sure he could see everything that was going on from there, knew she was pregnant too. It was a gamble, of course, and with the money that had fallen on her from the sky, or rather had been shoved into her bag, Kelly had bought a modest house in the countryside rather than a luxurious city flat, which would have sufficed for her. She put the rest of the money into an account. She wanted silence, the silence from Voznesensky's poems. "I want silence, silence. Are my nerves burned? Silence." So that the shadow of the pine tree, tickling us, shifting, chilling us like a prank, along our backs to the little toes of our feet, of silence. The man who had sold her house was overjoyed. Some years ago he had built this little house for his old mother, to replace the wooden hut that had promised her. 1 room, a kitchen and facilities in a small cubbyhole at the end of the corridor. What else do you need to live? But the mother had already turned 95, and even in this house box she could no longer live alone. Her son took her to his house. The house, painted for some reason in the color of sea waves, remained an orphan. for country roads for country dwellers cramped, but Kelly just right. She arrived with only one bag, and at first she was afraid if someone came to the wicket, looking out from behind the curtain, trying to see who needed it. But Tom didn't look for her. He rang once. Kelly's heart snapped when she saw who the call was from, but all he asked was, "You're not coming back?" "No." "Are you paunchy or something?" He guessed. "Not your concern. And the baby's not yours." "Indeed, it's not mine, at least begging with this child, if you're so stupid." "What's it to me?" "That's what I called to say I've changed the locks in the flat, so I can't come and take out whatever you want. And Jane's home most of the day." Anyone else would have wished Jane would choke on other people's stuff. But Kelly was too quiet. All she said was, "We've been together so many years, and you don't know me that well." She was settling into the village. Any walk turned into a long journey. You have to go to the shop, put an hour on it. To the pharmacy, to the post office that's even further. Only the church was close. Almost across the road you could see the domes through the window. The church, by some whim of fate, was the same color as her hut. But it was not a second home for Kelly. The priest was too peculiar. Father Valentine had nothing in common with that legendary Valentine of love. Soon Kelly began to suspect that the priest had been exiled to such a remote village for his brashness. He considered himself to be the first authority for everyone. He criticized even his own superiors, going as far as the patriarch and parishioners, at whom he was angry. Could get a nettle on the forehead from the expansive priest. The women who worked in the temple hoped that it was a youthful thing, that it would all pass. The only sin that the priest could admit to with a stiffened heart was that he was a complete stranger to Nestiazatism. His house was the best in the village, and there was room for another church. Still, Kelly came to the services at least once in a while, stood at the door, and as soon as she felt stuffy, hurried out into the fresh air. Luckily for her, the family had a hospital, not a hospital, but a small, cool, almost empty old hospital, where Kelly was monitored so that she didn't have to travel far in a crowded bus to the district center. Gradually, Kelly was drawn into her new existence. She planted her own herbs in the vegetable garden, remembered the names of the local shop assistants. She was already left her favorite buns and Rajenka when the goods were finished. People on the street greeted her. And yet she was afraid of the nights. In the city, the night is conventional, except that at 2 or 3 o'clock the streets quiet down for a while. The village, on the other hand, was sinking into darkness like the sea. Rare lanterns and lights not in all the houses. The darkness seemed to swamp everything around it. The glowing windows somewhere made one think of a ship standing in the distance, on the roadstead. Anything could happen at night. Kelly was afraid that her labor would start at night too, and the ambulance wouldn't arrive in time. So she agreed to go to the hospital a few days before her due date, and was glad she hadn't had time to get a cat like she wanted. Who would she leave her with now? There was nothing left for her but to rely entirely on fate. Would she live? Would the baby be all right? Would she have the strength to look after it? All this now depended not on her, but on some higher power. But everything had gone remarkably well. She even managed somehow to brace herself internally, and not to scream. And the boy that Anne the midwife had shown her had been very good too, though his face was red and puffy. "But look at his eyes, they're silver," said Anne. "I've never seen anything like them, really." Kelly knew she wouldn't name the baby James. She was superstitious now, catching the signs of fate. The son was not to repeat his father's fate. And a week later, when she returned home, staggering from weakness, she knew what name she would give her son Mark. They had never had such a name in their family before. Let everything begin with a clean slate. Father Valentine insisted that all newborns be baptized in the church. God forbid, not at home, even in the bitter cold. "Boys are brought into the altar," he said. "How can you deprive a child of that?" It was August. It smelled of apples, and at night the stars flew to earth as often as snow in winter. Mark's godparents were neighbors, husband and wife, Chloe and Ethan. When the boy was brought to the temple, he laughed for the first time. He was lying in Ethan's arms and pulling his hands upwards to where the blue haze of the dome was, and he laughed as if he saw someone he knew and was happy about it. "He sees angels," said the woman who cleaned the temple. There was sadness in her voice. Seeing angels is also a challenge, because cleanliness has to be matched. What Mark was seeing, naturally, no one knew about until the boy spoke. No one even understood what was going on. Well, the child laughs and stretches his arms as if someone is standing in front of him, but probably many babies do that. And sometimes, especially at night, when Kelly put him to bed, Mark would cry and wrap himself in the blanket, as if he hoped to escape under it. "What are you afraid of?" Luba coaxed him affectionately. "There's no one in the room, only you and me and the cat sitting over there, washing itself. The cat that they had been given as a present and crossed themselves over. Probably the neighbors didn't know where to give the litter." It was the most ordinary, gray-collared, nasal, big-eyed. Later it seemed to Luba that she had special feelings for the boy. There was a cupboard in the room, left by the previous owner. They had been like this in almost every house before, tall, wooden, with hangers on the right, shelves on the left, and a square of glass in the door, covered with embroidery. On a black background, an old woman had painted roses with a needle and thread. Mark was afraid of the wardrobe at night. During the day he could climb into it and play there, God knows what he imagined, among the hangers of dresses. He could have a house or a spaceship in there, but when it started to get dark, the first place where that darkness descended was the wardrobe ajar. Mark didn't even dare look in there. And if his gaze did fall there by chance, he withdrew it immediately, as if something terrible lurked there and watched him from there, something better not to be seen face to face. Then the cat would leap to Mark and stare into the darkness herself, staring with cold yellow eyes, as if she were on guard and watching. She knew unmistakably when the boy was worried, when he was having nightmares, and she would slip in and lay on his chest, becoming a shield between him and those he feared. Distracted by her song, she purred surprisingly loudly. As Mark began to talk, Kelly asked him, "Honey, what do you see?" "There," he answered expressively, nodding at the cupboard and raising his eyebrows, not understanding how the obvious could not be clear to her, and almost adding, "There it is." Sometimes, to his mother's utter consternation, Mark began to mutter excitedly and quickly, talking either to himself or to someone whom today's psychologists like to call an imaginary friend. In everything else, the boy not only did not differ from his peers for the worse, he outperformed them. About 3 years old, learned to read, and by the time he went to school, read many books from the Library of Adventures. He knew a lot of poetry, wrote in jagged block letters, and had the kind of imagination that made the fairy tales so beloved by children pale in comparison. On a warm April evening, Kelly sat with Mark by the river. Even though she was settling in a new place, but still she could call only her son her soulmate. And when she had the chance, she took him by the hand, and they went for a walk somewhere far away, then along the path among the meadows that bloomed so gloriously in summer. Then between the mysterious ferns, the forest was in darkness, and the ferns seemed to glow by themselves with a soft green light to a distant lake or following the bends of the river, where the local boys did not climb. They sat on the cliff, looking at the swift current, at the sand. It was amazing here, almost completely white, silky, and suddenly Mark touched his mother's elbow. "Look, Mum, there's a leshy," he said. Kelly took a look. It was just a huge, human-sized stump with petrified, intertwined roots. Look at it. It's the woodsman leaning over the river. He is old. He came out of the forest after winter and came to say hello to the mermaid. She is looking at him from the pool, and he extends his hand to her, saying, "Well, have you survived the cold?" Kelly realized it was all imagination. "You'll probably write your own book someday." She kept wanting to hug her son, to hold him. And every time she held back from doing it, she couldn't. She couldn't let Mark become too tender, too vulnerable. He had to live in a cruel world. She knew that well. "No, Mom, and I'd love not to see it, but it's there, you know. We went to the cemetery yesterday," he said, even with irritation. They did go there yesterday, along with an old lady neighbor who had asked him to help clean up a grave. It was already difficult for her to bend over, but she wanted to visit her husband. The old lady walked with her right hand resting on a stick, with Kelly supporting her on her left. "So?" Her mother didn't understand. Mark sighed. "There was also a funeral going on at that time, remember? Well, this auntie," she stood back and watched. "What lady?" Kelly asked. Mark patiently explained. "The one they thought was buried." She stood to the side and watched them. Only she was a little different, not like them, as if she were made of thick fog, a little transparent, wearing a white polka-dot blouse, a pleated skirt, and a scarf. Kelly inwardly gasped. She knew who Mark was talking about, because she had gone to say goodbye to the deceased. She was already part of that circle when everyone from the neighborhood saw the deceased off, when neighbors came to celebrate a wedding or a birth. But she hadn't taken Mark with her to the house yesterday, and the only thing he could see in the cemetery was a staked coffin. Kelly squatted down in front of her son and took him by the shoulders. "I'm begging you," she said. "No, I beg you. Tell me everything you see that others don't see, only me. Only me. Do you understand?" He looked at her earnestly, with his silver eyes, which the further they went the more they took on a marvelous hue. She was not a hypnotist, she could not suggest anything to him, but he could sense from her tone that the matter was serious. "Do you understand?" She tried to explain to him as an adult. "If you like this, left and right will start to tell everyone about the Forresters and ghosts. At first people will think that you're making up everything, that you just think it, and when you grow up a little, you'll be locked up in a madhouse." "Where to?" "Ben." He had this habit of raising his eyebrows. "It's a place where they lock you in a room and don't let you see your mum. There are bars on the windows. You sit on a chain like a dog and they feed you from a dog bowl." In her heart, Kelly asked the higher powers to forgive her for this cruelty, because the worst thing for her was that if Mark was declared insane, they might not put him in an asylum, but they wouldn't be able to avoid notoriety. And if it stuck, alas, forever. Mark nodded. "But if something scares you, if there's something you want to share, we'll talk to you about it," Kelly insinuated, squeezing his hand painfully. "But only to me, only to me, only to me about it. Deal?" Mark kept his word. What he'd really been through, even Kelly didn't know. You can't describe every shadow, every look or call from the beyond. Mark had learned to hold back. The only time he'd nearly blundered was when, in 10th grade, the boys had decided to celebrate Halloween. By this time, his classmates already knew that Mark was the best artist in the school, and he was asked to make up those who came in costumes. One of the worst bullies, Alex Smith, dressed up as a devil, and when he sat down on a chair in front of Mark, he looked up and shuddered. Then he picked up a box of paints, but every time he swung the brush, Mark looked away, as if he were drawing a picture from the original. The makeup was amazing. Alex was scared of himself in the mirror. "How did you come up with that?" he asked, looking at the creepy image he had created. There he stands. Mark started and stopped, and that autumn he was being drafted into the army. Kelly desperately didn't want to let her son go, but she just didn't know how to avoid it. He'd grown up to be a healthy, good-looking lad, the kind of guy who wouldn't be rejected by the medical board. Unless he had to pay someone a bribe, there was money. But how to do it all? Kelly agonized. She was embarrassed, ashamed, but she felt more sorry for Mark. "No need, Mom. I'll go and come back," said the son. "That's what I'm telling you. Let's go into town while we still have time. You can show me your father's grave." Kelly didn't know where James was buried, but it wasn't hard to find him. Every cemetery has its Rublevka, and this was one, laid out in the bad 90s. It was first inhabited by higher-class gangsters, victims of contract killings and random shootings. Then, they were joined by businessmen from the same gangster circles of higher class, but they stayed here longer. Servants of the people, and the heads of the last surviving factories were added here. The monuments were rich black or colored granite 1.5, 2 human heights. Gloomy spruce trees, heavy chains fencing off the slabs of the grounds. The burials were with reserve, with the expectation for the whole family in the future. But sometimes there were decent men here. James had a simple white marble monument. On his gravestone were surgical gloves and a scalpel, as if he'd just come back from an operation and dropped them without looking. Kelly was grateful to fate that the grave had been found, and so quickly that she could show it to her son. She shifted her gaze from the monument to her son, who was taller than she was. Mark stood and stared, his face growing more and more perplexed. And then he said, "There's no one here." "What do you mean?" "The coffin is empty." Kelly searched for an explanation. She already knew her son wasn't wrong, but there was no way he could be right. "But it's been so long, and there was a big fire. It must have been like a crematorium." Mark only shook his head, but he looked at his mother again and said nothing. They walked towards the exit along the cemetery alley, and golden maple leaves swirled above them. Mark served really well. He wrote letters to his mother, which not only had no complaints, but always a joke, always a light mockery, and Kelly smiled as she read them. But he didn't go back. He found a job in town. And what a job. Kelly fought with her son for almost the first time. "Your father's going to curse me from the dead," she said in tears. He was ahead, above everyone else, a real intellectual, a scientist. He probably could not even imagine that his son would not go to the institute. "Where are you going?" "To the dog shelter, washing bowls and cleaning up faces." "Mum." Mark's voice came through the phone as if his son were there. "At least there's no blackness, none at all, even when they're dying." "Well, you know all dogs go to heaven." The shelter was run by volunteers. There were only 1, 2, or 4 regular workers. Emma, who was considered the owner, was an attractive middle-aged blonde. She had a good voice, and from time to time she organized charity concerts in town. She sang to earn the dogs and cats some bread, or rather chicken carcasses, groats, and dry food. And then there was Mary, who cleaned the small little dogs that sat in separate cages. The cages stood on top of each other, and the whole thing looked like an open multi-story house. Mary kept order and had some veterinary skills. And finally there was Mark, who did all the heavy lifting. He was paid enough for food in a rented flat, a modest 1-bedroom. However, he was not always able to go there at night. 500 tailed souls lived in the shelter, and it often turned out that some of them could not be left unattended even for a few hours. The shelter was enclosed by a high, blank fence. It was located almost outside the city, in an industrial zone. There was no housing here. Still, many people had strong feelings about the shelter. Some people were disturbed by the very fact of its existence. These people demanded the destruction of all the inhabitants of the shelter, and sometimes even threw poison in pieces of meat over the fence. Others brought in dogs and cats that they could not keep for some reason. Sometimes they solved the issue honestly. They paid a fee. Sometimes they tried to drive up quietly, tied the dog at the gate, and left, saying that they would take the poor thing anyway. They wouldn't go anywhere. Just behind the fence there was a hut. It was considered to be Emma's office. But in fact it served as a servant's quarters for everyone. There were refrigerators with dog food and medicines. Here the weakest puppies lived in boxes, and here the shelter duty officer, most often Mark, slept on the sofa. There was also a large structure that looked like a hangar. Small dogs lived in cages here and cats in a separate room. And in the courtyard there were enclosures close together, one to the other, with 2 big dogs in each enclosure. Morning was the time when it was impossible to sit down. Mark cooked food for the animals on the fire. The shelter had poor amenities. Even light and water were constantly cut off because of debts. If possible, water was stored in large bowls, and almost every day rats drowned in them, which could not be eradicated. Feed the animals, clean the cages, give injections to the sick, take someone to the vet. Time flew by. In the afternoon, volunteers, mostly schoolgirls, would arrive and the lucky dogs would go for a walk with them. Hands were in short supply, and someone would get a chance to get out of their cage once every few months. Every dog and every cat had a hard fate behind them. Mark felt sorry for all of them, but he had a special relationship with Gerda, a sheepdog who came to the shelter last year. Later we learned that the owner had culled the dog because its ears did not stand up in due time. So as a teenager, Gerda found herself on the street. She joined a small pack of stray dogs. Together, in the jungle of the big city, it was easier to survive. She fell in love with the pack. Volunteers found the sheepdog in the winter. She hadn't left her mate for 24 hours. He was hit by a car and was still alive, slowly freezing. They took the dog to the clinic and gave the dogs names. He's Kai, she's Gerda. An emergency collection for treatment was announced, but Kai could not be saved. Gerda stayed at the shelter. Sheepdogs in general pick up everything on the fly, and Gerda eventually started to live out of her enclosure. She was so intelligent that she freely walked around the territory at night, guarding it. During the day she watched out for strangers who came to the shelter, but never once bit anyone. For some reason, she chose Mark out of all of them and stayed near him, and somehow, in between, easily learned all the commands. And now, when Mark stayed overnight in the shed, he sat on the doorstep, watching the sunset, and Gerda lay at his feet. Maybe some people complained about the stale air around the shelter, too many dogs, no matter how much you cleaned, but Mark breathed easy here. He was used to seeing more than the others, and though he was used to it, he was often uneasy among people. In the shelter, those attentive eyes, hot breathing tongues, the hope to live another day, and the vast sky above his head. There were no high-rise buildings around the sky. Looked at the dogs, and many went there on their last journey because there were enough sick and crippled. Feeding, treating, placing in good hands, all this was hard work, and it occupied both hands and thoughts. This was Mark's place on Earth. The car pulled up in the evening. The first to hear it, of course, was Gerda. Seeing the dog's upturned muzzle, Mark listened too. Someone else has been brought in, he thought. Now they'll leave them and go away. If they're helpless puppies or kittens in a box, leave them outside overnight. They might live till morning. The hour was already quite late. Mark was lying on the sofa, watching a film of French comedy as old as this little TV set. As he was putting on his shoes, a car honked. Whoever was there wasn't going to run away quietly like a thief. Gerda, of course, had linked up with him to check the situation and make sure Mark wasn't in any danger. Near the gate, not far from the lilac bushes, you couldn't see them in the darkness, only the sweet smell could be heard, stood a black Jeep, and next to it a woman of small stature, with smoothly slicked back hair, also all in black jacket jeans. Sometimes Mark sensed something unkind coming from the man, but it wasn't there now. But anxiety was born and grew. "Did you bring someone?" he asked, saying hello. "It would be better to do it this afternoon. There is a contract to be drawn up." "I'm here to see you, Mark," said the woman. Her voice was slightly hoarse, but what surprised Mark most of all was that she knew him by name. He had almost no acquaintances in town, outside the shelter, except for volunteers and veterinarians. "What did you want from me? Can we talk to you?" He caught the insistence in her voice and hesitated to ask her out. "There's a dozen puppies in the shed. Not every untrained person could handle it. To the dogs, they'd raise a fuss." "Let's get in the car," the woman said. She didn't switch on the interior lights, and when Mark sat down next to her, he could see her face in profile, lit only by the light of the moon. Gerda remained lying beside the car. "I wanted to offer you a job," said the woman. He was even more confused. "But I'm not going to leave here." She turned towards him. The darkness now completely hid her face, and only her eyes glittered slightly. "Mark, I'm not going to lure you away from the orphanage with tempting conditions. It's more serious than that. My husband and your father were once friends. I'm the only one who knows whose son you are, and God forbid anyone else should find out." She did manage to stun him. "Listen to what I have to say." She touched his hand, her fingers were icy cold. "Your father's death has remained a mystery to the inquiry, hasn't it?" He didn't speak of what he'd discovered in the cemetery. He just nodded. "The investigators couldn't find out who was involved in James's death. All ends in water. It's a cult, Mark. It's the kind of force that shouldn't be allowed into our lives." The woman introduced herself. Her name was Isabella, and her husband, also now deceased, was Sam. She and James grew up together, went to medical school together. James was truly one of a kind. Such heightened sensitivity multiplied by knowledge. Disease has 1,000 subtle signs that even doctors don't always pay attention to. There's no way to put them all together. James saw, felt, anticipated. I don't remember him being wrong. 01759, my husband didn't have anywhere near that gift, but sometimes he had dreams. And yes, while your father was a surgeon, my husband was a psychiatrist. And so, the woman was silent, whether to cope with her feelings or to choose her words. At first it seemed that all these people, mostly young people, boys and girls, that they were just looking for extreme sports and had gone a little bit far where it was dangerous. They flocked from all over the world, even from Siberia, I think. I learned that later on by crumbs, by drops. The newcomers signed an agreement in blood, of course, that they renounced any faith and would serve only darkness. They met first at the home of one of these sectarians who lived on the outskirts of the city. Then they found a hut in the woods. Rituals, ceremonies, reading books on black magic. You see, Mark, you can't joke about this. Even with the occult aspects aside, it just makes you go crazy fast. And yes, they had sacrifices. They started with pets. And I won't tell you what they did to them. It'll hurt you to hear it. But eventually they got to humans. Firstly, once you joined the sect, you couldn't leave alive. Secondly, it was believed that if a person with a special gift was sacrificed, everyone who participated in the ritual would become stronger. So they searched for such unusual people. And of course they couldn't miss your father. And yes, he knew about it, knew they had sentenced him. So why didn't he go? How many were there? You mean the police? There's about 100 of them today, as far as I know. When you're dealing with fanatics of an idea, especially an idea like this, it's scary. What police? If you're sentenced, tomorrow on the street a random passerby will just stick a shiv in your side. Believe me, there will be a way. My husband took your father's death very hard. He said that the leaders of this sect were mentally ill, that they needed to be treated. There were cases. He discouraged kids from going there, discouraged all those who were lured by this black romance. And he paid the price. He was next. He had a gift, too. James told Sam about your mum, so I've been following her life from afar, and I know who you are. And now my daughter's in danger. I think you're the only one who can protect her. Mark was released with great reluctance. It was only when he left unexpectedly and without any clear reason that it became clear how indispensable he was to the orphanage. Mark assured them he wasn't going for long. But he said it out of thin air, and he wasn't sure of anything. If Isabella was a wealthy woman, as he thought, she could hire a professional guard, or even a bodyguard for her daughter. He himself had no skills under his belt other than the army, where Mark had been trained as a signalman and had been allowed to shoot a machine gun once. What Isabella was hoping for was beyond his comprehension. I'll tell you more about it on the spot, she promised and added as a control shot. Please don't refuse, in memory of my father, in memory of their friendship with my husband. And now they were driving this very black Jeep, and looking through the tinted windows was literally seeing the world in black, as if he were deeply depressed. How did your husband die? Mark asked, because it was going to be a long journey and there was something to talk about. Isabella gripped the steering wheel tighter as the tarmac changed to dirt and the car shook. No big deal to anyone. I went to the dacha in early spring with my daughter, with Mia, and went fishing, and then they found him. He was lying face down in the water. We were told he'd suffocated. There was no water in his lungs. It was his heart. But couldn't that have happened? Lots of people have heart attacks. Why do you suspect someone? It's paranoia, isn't it? I'm too afraid for my daughter. Isabella said melancholically. All these years I've been following this sect as far as I can, even if indirectly, even if by word of mouth, but these guys have what they call their own handwriting. Do you understand? They offered both of them, first James, then Sam, to join them. If your dad wanted to, he could have made a career out of it. Imagine when one of their adepts can see through people, diagnose and heal, how cool that would be for them. After he flat out refused, he was warned since he didn't want to be a follower, he would become a victim. And then there was that final warning when he realized that it was serious, and that he was essentially condemned. That's when he met your mother. It's kind of a miracle that you were born, you know? And Sam was ruined by his tongue. He was mocking and openly trying to fight against them. I warned him against it. It was no use. When he left for a while, I thought it was a coincidence too, a tragic accident. Of course, these guys wouldn't stop. Sacrifice is a regular ritual. And all those people, victims of fires that happen somewhere in the woods or in old abandoned houses, it's their work. But the other day, traditionally, with the onset of the warm season, the family would move to the cottage. This continued even after Sam's death. Lydia has her own firm. She is an interior designer and often went to the customers in the morning, and Mia was left alone. The garden community is small. It's quiet, grassy streets are deserted for part of the day. All the neighbors know each other, and a new person is immediately in sight. But Mia, lying in a hammock in the garden, was not alert when she saw a stubby boy, about her own age. He asked for a drink, and she let him draw water from their well. Even in the heat of the day, the water was cold and clear as a tear. "Don't you miss your father?" he asked, suddenly winking at her. "Don't be sad. You'll meet him soon." Isabella kept her daughter safe. She didn't tell her anything scary, anything that might frighten or upset her. That's why Mia didn't pay much attention to the conversation, but she passed it on to her mother. A strange man came in, and Isabella was terribly worried. They're going round and round, you see. They've got some kind of diabolical circle. The murders happen in the same places at roughly equal intervals. When these people target someone, they act with the tenacity of fanatics. They have to get what they want at all costs, you know. At any cost. There's no logic to it. Isabella slowed down and turned to Mark. Her voice sounded almost pleading. "Do you see why I came to you? Everywhere I go now, I get laughed at. Some boy asked for water and said something. But my husband's death has nothing to do with criminality in the eyes of everyone. What do you think of it?" if there's no sign of violence? Sam was startled by something, startled to such a degree, so horrified that his heart stopped. That look on his face, then his features smoothed out. But I remember I saw him shortly after, and that's when it all started again. It was your mum, Mark, who told me about the gift you inherited from your father. Only it's gone further with you, you see more. Only you can sense trouble coming. I'm not asking you to get involved, God forbid. I'm not asking you to go into battle for my Mia, but to warn you, just to warn you, to hide her somewhere in time. They won't be after you. They know nothing about you, though you would no doubt be a very valuable asset to them. If you fall into their clutches, it's like falling into the clutches of a spider. You can't get out. They drug the victim, then scotch them. No one hears anything, and they don't find the victim right away. I only know you won't believe it, because thanks to your gift, what others can only laugh at is unquestionable to you. Gerda lay at Mark's feet, shifting her gaze from Isabella to her master and breathing hotly, sticking out her tongue. It was indeed a fertile corner. Isabella, with a special key, opened the gates of the garden community, and they seemed to enter a completely different world, where silence, emerald grass, birdsong, and negativity. On this day there were no dacha dwellers. Only one woman was digging up the soil on her plot, and a man was lying on the veranda on an old sofa, and his peace was rested by a dog, but good-natured it did not even bark at the car. Isabella's cottage struck Mark. It was something between a rustic cottage in the mountains somewhere in Europe and a medieval castle. A real tower of rough stone beckoned to the eye. "Wow," he said involuntarily. Isabella glanced round, grinned. "I like this place. There's a lake nearby, you'll see. But when I bought the land, it was all overgrown with wild grapes, and there was a half-collapsed hut hiding in it. Why a tower? I'm an extreme designer, and I've loved Bradbury since I was a kid. At the end of every spring I bought dandelion wine, and by autumn I'd read the book to death. I just breathed it. I learned to see the miracles in everything around me." Once a week, Douglas was allowed to sleep in his grandfather's tower. He'd run up the dark spiral staircase to the top and go to sleep in that magician's abode amidst thunder and visions. And in the early hours of the morning, when even the milkman was not yet clinking bottles in the streets, he would wake up and work his cherished magic. Now, Mia adores the place. At the very top of the tower, a platform opens up. There you can admire the moon and greet the dawn, or sometimes both at once. Mia calls the tower visiting the sky. Mia was thin and small. There was no way she could be 18 years old, a teenage schoolgirl, that's all. Gerda interested her much more than Mark. Already getting acquainted on the porch, she was ready to caress her, but hesitated. She won't bite, she's smart. So don't be afraid. They switched to you almost immediately, though. Isabella went to the kitchen to find something to feed the young people. Mark knew that by evening she would have to leave and spend the night in the city, because early in the morning she would be waiting for a client, an intrusive uncle who wanted to make everything in his mansion to the highest standards. "I suggest green borscht." Isabella looked out of the kitchen. "How's that?" "Mia, show Mark around the neighborhood, take him to the lake." For Gerda, getting to know the area was of the utmost importance. She walked ahead of the young people. Mark was not mistaken. This green corner was deserted at this hour, golden flowers on the grass, and Mia walking on his right hand. The girl was walking with her head down, as if she wanted to find something among the grass and flowers. Mark didn't feel anything wrong yet. The day was too sunny, the breeze too warm and gentle. There was no room for shadows. From this edge of the fellowship was surrounded by a wooden fence, a rather dilapidated one, though. Micah ducked into a gap where a board had fallen off and waited for Mark to follow. Further on, beyond a small hill, there was a lake, marked on the maps as Pridorojnoi, though it was quite far from any roads, and just beyond the lake the forest began. Dachniks came here to catch small fish or just sit by the water. They took good photos here. The lake was small, but framed by the forest and weeping willows, it was picturesque. However, Mark's heart was suddenly racing. He saw several butterflies, big black beauties, fluttering over the water. Mark even blinked, hoping it was a vision, that he was just overheating in the sun. They couldn't be here. He had once looked up the species in a book and had learnt that they lived somewhere else. But he'd seen them several times before the news of someone's sudden death. "What do you think?" he asked Maya after all, nodding at that black dance. If she had seen it too, she would have said something like, "How beautiful." "The boys are swimming here." Mia shrugged her shoulders. "I tried it once and lost my footing. The bottom was too boggy. They say there's a ford somewhere. I don't know where." They settled down on the bank, right on the grass, dry and warm. Mark didn't know if he could ask Mia. Did she know anything about what she was facing? Was she afraid? But as it turns out, children know more than their parents realize. Mia started this conversation on her own. "I know why your mom called you." She wasn't looking at Mark, she was looking at the lake. "But I don't think it's worth it. There's some serious guys out there. What are you going to do with them? Even with the dog." "What makes you think they're so serious?" he asked with deliberate carelessness. "You see, Mom can keep her mouth shut, but not that serious. When she started asking me questions, she let something slip. And then I did what I could on my own. They just don't accept the weak. They have a whole series of entrance tests. A marathon not to run, but to walk with heavy rucksacks through the mountains. Not everyone made it, but they have a death cult. They are not afraid of it. You can't die, you can't play in all this, you can't immerse yourself in it, the darkness will pull you in." Who would you say that to? Mark thought. And then the epic continues. They order their own knives. Like personal, magical knives. There are special blacksmiths there too, with runes and signs on the knives. And each of them has to drink blood with his knife, choose it himself, catch it and sacrifice someone. Gerda raised her head and looked at the girl carefully. Mia rubbed her head, dared her. At least a bird or a cat. There is a real gradation of victims. Forest animals are valued higher because they are harder to catch. Try to catch one, even a hare. And the highest sacrifice is a human. Mia looked Mark straight in the eye. The ultimate sacrifice is yourself. When you don't make an attempt on someone, but lie down on the altar yourself. Isabella fed him a delicious green borscht and left a fridge full of food. "I'll try to be here tomorrow evening, the day after tomorrow at the earliest. I know Mia doesn't bother with cooking, at least make yourself some sandwiches and coffee. I'll leave the cutlets in the pot under the lid. Please." Now she was talking to Mark. "Lock the gate well at night." They met sunsets in the tower, or rather at the very top, on the platform Mia had chosen. They drank coffee, watched the sun sink behind the lake. "It's a full moon tonight," Mia said. "I don't know if they believe in anything other than their sect and who they think is their master. I read a book about vampires when I was a kid. It said that vampires loved moonlit nights, and that they followed the moonbeams like a river." Mark was busy with a more mundane task. He opened a satellite map and studied his surroundings, slowly moving his finger over the map on his mobile screen. "Is that a swamp?" he wondered, pointing to where the holiday village ended. "Not exactly. It's boggy, but it's not really a swamp. Except in spring, when the water stands for a long time, and in autumn it all thins out. But in summer the ground dries up and there are so many flowers there." "What's this?" Mark pointed his finger. "A settlement. Look, there seems to be a path leading there, quite far from here, and I don't know whether there are houses or not." "It's not a path, it's a concrete road, a slab road. And where you're pointing, there used to be a village there. It's almost gone now, just ruins. I know that a man lived there for a long time, hiding from his wife. He said he was happy there. It was quiet." "How do you know all this?" "My father used to take me there on his motorbike. He was hoping to find the treasure. Dad had this romanticism in him. There's a mountain, or a hill about 60 meters high. There's lowlands all around. And when you get to the hill, you can see everything. Dad said there's a whole network of caves and underground passages. God knows who dug them and when. It was either an underground monastery or a hiding place for bandits. Papa was always very careful that I didn't stumble or fall into anything. And he made me promise that I would never go there alone, because if anything happened there, there would be no help. No one would even know where you had disappeared. I don't know why Dad thought that. I wouldn't have gone myself, it's too far." "Did you love your father very much?" Unexpectedly to himself, Mark asked. It was already evening light, but it seemed to him that she had tears in her eyes. Maya nodded. "Very much. Most of all, Mum is nice, but she always has things to do, always has her head full. And for my father, I knew there was no one more important than me." "Do you remember your father?" "I've only seen pictures of him." He was quite a famous man. More than famous. Mia confirmed it. Do you have those weird eyes? You know, they're like mirrors. It seems that just a little more and something so otherworldly will be reflected in the mirrors or windows to another world. She shifted her gaze and shuddered. Look over there. She pointed towards the lake, where the darkness had already thickened. What is there? Mark lowered his voice involuntarily and wished they were still at the top of the tower, out in the open. Look at those green lights. There's two. Fireflies, maybe? They're small. I couldn't see them from up here. It's far away. You mean eyes? Mark might have wanted to make a mocking tone in his voice to cheer the girl up, but the question sounded serious against his will. No, not eyes. Maybe it was a torch. Let's get out of here. You go to your room and I'll check the gate again. And then Gerda and I will go round the estate. The dog hasn't felt threatened yet. Maybe the key word was yet. But Mark sat in Mia's room for a long time, and she told him what she had learned. About how a willing victim spends his last night among the sectarians, about the farewell ceremony and the actual sacrifice and such horrors. Finally, he noticed that the girl's eyes were beginning to slip. When he came to himself, however, he went back to the satellite maps for some reason, found the very same hill and zoomed in, as if hoping to see some traces of life there, or at least the very caves. Mark woke up to the fact that the room was cold. It was not uncommon to have frost in the morning. Now the wind must have opened the window, and Mark felt cold. Gerda put her paws on the windowsill. It was just beginning to dawn, and the sheepdog was looking out into the twilight and shivering visibly. Mark got up to shut the window more quickly, rubbed the dog on the withers, saying that now we would warm up. But Gerda was still shivering. Without realizing why, Mark went out into the corridor. The front door was closed. But as soon as the young man touched the handle, the door opened into the dark garden. Someone had opened the English lock. Mark started quickly up the stairs. He had not yet called out to the girl, though he would very much like to do so. So what if everything is safe and Mia is asleep and he wakes her up? He quietly opened the door to her room. Gerda slipped past him, and he didn't have time to stop her. The room was empty, only the white crumpled bed, the window closed. Gerda was sniffing at something on the floor. Mark crouched down and, not believing himself, touched a smeared spot of blood. They ran towards the lake, Mark following the sheepdog. The grass was damp with icy dew, the branches wet. The lake at this hour was like silver mirrors. They've crossed it, Mark thought, to break the trail. But how did they get Mia out with a knife to her throat? Not a peep then. He gazed. There was a black line drawn precisely on the water. The butterflies had lined up, marking the ford with their wings. On the other side of the lake, Gerda had picked up the trail at once, but he would have found the way without her. He had looked at the map too long and too closely the day before to be mistaken. It was a concrete road, old, not wide, 2 slabs only. Between these slabs, grass was already growing thickly. At first, the road led him to a river, over which there was a bridge, a plank bridge, over which a car could pass. On the other bank were trees, huge trunks of trees uprooted, their roots intertwined and twisted, and from afar they looked like giant spiders blocking the way. Mark knew he had a long way to go. He had no doubt where Mia had been taken. It would take him hours to get there, and he would have to listen every minute to see if anyone was around. And he couldn't wait. Mark had brought his phone with him, but it was of little use here. The connection was not catching an empty white triangle in the corner of the screen. Not a single bar. Gerda realized that her master was in a hurry. She was ready to break off into a run, but then she would break away from him. She went far ahead, and she walked beside him, and Mark walked quickly, then switched to a run. The sun was already beginning to rise, showing its red side from behind the horizon, when Mark reached the abandoned village. It was a sad sight. 700 people had once lived here, but there were few reminders of it anymore. The shrubbery had grown so high that it hid the shrubberies, which had fallen into disrepair. Only the roofs were visible, and the streets were still visible. One might have thought that this place would attract those who practiced a death cult. But Mark felt there was no one here. To turn on and there would be a lake, the shores of which were so favored by vipers that it would be better not to go there without boots. To the protected mountain. The way lay straight ahead. Only the concrete ended here, and there was only a path left. Now he had to be doubly careful. It was already light, and they were close. Whenever possible, Mark tried to walk at the edge of the forest without losing sight of the path, and when he noticed a long, high hill ahead, he retreated into the thicket. It was a place that all the locals tried to avoid. It was tempting, though there was a rumor that untold riches were hidden here. Who kept them here? Who knows? Bandits. Who else? But who? According to some rumors, those whose ataman was Stenka Razin, according to others, the companions of Imli and Pugashev. And whoever said it all started with the old believers. They inhabited the local caves, deepened them, and then gave permission to those who came here to escape from the authorities, or just from the evil Baron to settle in the neighborhood. It happened that the robbers stayed here for the winter, and in the spring they left for their criminal activities on the big water. But who settled in the caves now? When Mark saw the smoke, he crawled the last few meters rather than walked. Gerda knew the command to crawl perfectly well and breathed noisily. In a few minutes, Mark was already looking at the sight before him. Mia had said, like her mother, that there were about 100 people in this sect, or what the hell to call it. But now Mark noticed 12 too. For some reason, it reminded him of all the reenactment clubs. Right at the foot of the mountain, there was a fire, but not a strange one, not a sacrificial one, but just warming and cooking breakfast. And someone didn't care much about firewood. They used dried out wood. That's why there was smoke from it. Many of the guys were really strong physically, even outwardly it was noticeable, were dressed in some strange gray hoods or cloaks of coarse cloth. Maybe such clothes were practical here, they protected them from the morning cold and annoying midges. And they were not sorry to get dirty or burnt by sparks from the fire. But only the Middle Ages came to mind, with its bonfires and the mad eyes of fanatics. A very thin man with gray hair grown back below his shoulders was stirring the brew in a cauldron. He was older than the others, and much older perhaps he was the head of the sect. But Mark dismissed the thought it was unlikely that the master would be serving the others, preparing their breakfast. What Mark hadn't expected was that the man would suddenly raise his eyes and look exactly where he was hiding in the dense foliage, and seemingly, despite such a veil, would see him. It was a total, absolute failure. And if he now called out to these boys and pointed in the direction where the stranger lurked, Mark would not escape or hide. And neither will Gerda. What will a dog do against so many people? It won't even stop them. And worst of all, no one and nothing will be able to save Mia. The man looked at him without taking his eyes off and seemed to have even dropped the spoon he was holding in his hand. Mark was also used to trusting his senses. This time he didn't feel threatened. Not only that, but he had a growing feeling that he knew this man from somewhere, even though it was impossible. Judging by his appearance, the man hadn't been out of the forest for a long time. And then the stranger's features seemed to overlap with a photograph in his memory, the one his mother had shown him. Mark blinked his eyes a lot. Wasn't James coming from the other side of the world? Or had he, after all? The man stood up and took a few steps toward Mark and suddenly put a finger to his lips. It was a gesture of invitation, saying, "Shay shall come to you now and we'll talk." Mark nodded. It was dangerous, though, terribly dangerous. Maybe the man only wanted to calm his guard, and then get close, grab his shoulder with his strong fingers, and then call the others. James, or whoever it was, took his time walking toward the thicket. There was no telling what the man was up to. It was only when the branches closed behind him and Mark was 2 steps away that the man squatted down beside him and asked, "Who are you? Who are you?" was the first thing that came to Mark's mind. "I recognized you by your eyes," James said quietly. "My grandfather had eyes like that." He raised his hand, wanting to touch Mark's eyelids, but didn't. Not just gray, but like molten metal. "My grandfather, too, saw things that no one else could. Your mom's Kelly, isn't she?" "So if I'm your son," Mark whispered. "And you're really alive, why the hell have you been stuck here for so many years? Or have you gone crazy too and become one of them?" "I haven't gone mad." James was so thin that his eyes seemed to have sunken deep. "It was just that they needed me alive then, to keep me with them. And they made it clear to me that if I didn't agree, the people closest to me would suffer. Sooner or later they would have found out about your mom and got to her. So what did you do with them?" "I treated them. I needed that kind of help here too. They also demanded to tell them everything I know about psyche hypothesis, about human superpowers. They hoped that I would teach them to be like myself, to develop the same abilities in them." "And what happened?" It sounded venomous, but James only grinned faintly. You know better than anyone that you're born with this gift, and it doesn't come from a black master. After all these years, you couldn't escape? There are guys here with a very unhappy and broken fate. Maybe it was pity that kept me here for a long time, but I tried to escape once. So, failed caught, beaten up, and I was tracked for a long time. You decided to stay with them, even after they'd killed your friend? Arseny shuddered and said quietly, "They didn't literally kill him, they wanted him to go with them, to live here. They showed him me on the phone, beaten up, while I was lying in a blackout. Anyway, he couldn't take it. I don't know the details. It must have been the heart. Who's in charge?" He didn't introduce himself. "I won't tell you his real name. They call him Karacourt here. He's completely mentally ill. He'd have to be on heavy medication, but that's why. Because of his weirdness, he's considered second to God. I mean, after the devil. What about you?" James apparently wanted to ask what had brought Mark here, but his son beat him to it. "So it's this Karacourt who's going to sacrifice Mia, the daughter of your best mate, tonight. Why don't you give him the knife? Will you hold a torch to the fire?" James flinched, and Mark realized he didn't know who Mia was. "Go over there, further into the woods," James said. "There's some sort of hunting lodge there, and wait. I don't know how long, maybe a long time, but I'll get her there for you." "Why should I believe you?" Mark asked. Arseny was silent for a few moments, then said sadly, "What else can you do?" Mark found the hunting lodge without difficulty, a small, old log cabin, where the two of them would have been cramped. No one had lived here for a long time, and it smelled rotten and damp inside. He let Hertha run round the neighborhood, and the sheepdog found a barely visible stream, from which they drank with pleasure, first the dog, then the master. The day was already drawing towards evening. There was still nothing to think of contacting the larger world, and Mark's spirits grew heavier and heavier. It was unlikely that Mia would be kept here for 2 whole nights. Most likely, everything would be resolved in a few hours. It would be much easier for them to drop off a body burnt beyond recognition than to hide a live girl, who of course would be searched for. Her mother would bring everyone to their feet, but now everything depended on one man, on Arseny, and he didn't seem quite normal to Mark either. How could one live for years among these ghouls and keep his sanity? Gerda was the first to hear the approach of the strangers. She jumped up, frozen like a statue. Mark put his palm on her withers. Quiet. He didn't want the dog to give them both away by barking or whimpering. James led Mia in front of him. She was barely walking. He was supporting her by the shoulder, and she too was wearing some kind of gray robe. The girl was unlike herself, tangled hair, a blank stare. "What's wrong with her?" Mark intercepted Mia. "She's just been drugged. Can you smell it? And a bit of dope. She's been told she's going to be killed anyway, and this will make it easier for her to accept the inevitable. Now, get her in as fast as you can." "But how will she walk in that condition?" Mark asked, almost desperately. "It's a long way. No one will chase you for a while. I promise. Stay close to the river, and as soon as you get a connection, call for help. Maybe they'll intercept you halfway down. What about you? If there's a willing victim..." "It's their favorite," James said nonchalantly, and before Mark could say anything, he was gone, disappearing into the fading twilight. One thing was certain: over the years, even in this monstrous environment, he'd had those who were indebted to him, whose favor he'd won and who felt affection for him. It was because of this that he had now succeeded in getting Mia out. He sat alone until late in the evening, in the very cave where the condemned had spent their last hours, praying to himself that his son and his mate would reach the humans safely. Occasionally he sipped from a jug of the wine that was generously served to the prisoners. Better to let them go to the altar like somnambulas than to drag them screaming like pigs. James didn't think about himself. To be honest, he didn't want to live either. His body had survived, but his soul had been burned almost to the ground. A willing sacrifice, in the eyes of the other members of the cult, that justified everything. James knew that Karacourt would go ballistic. That was what happened when James was eventually brought to him. The ringleader didn't grovel to the caves. He was the only one here who had a dwelling. Psychiatry was the subject James had been worst at the Institute. But looking into those eyes, black and seemingly pupilless, and watching this extremely pale man swallow saliva that dripped down his chin, James had no doubt that he belonged in the ward behind the iron door with the bars on the window. You let her go so they could find their way to us and wipe us all out. Ends in the water. The river's close by. Consider me sorry for the girl. It's better than what you were going to do to her. James said, You took her from us. If his voice softened, it was only a little. I'll replace her. James reached out his hand towards the ajar door, and someone put a torch in it. He knew who it was: Sophia, the girl who had come to the cult last. She still couldn't get used to it. Everything longed for her mother. James raised the torch, illuminating the hut, where a single candle still burned and darkness crowded the corners. Now it was spellbound brightly. All that scary tinsel, animal skins, rat skulls, acculturation books, all those black candles. The other boys still had a chance to get out. James had told his son the truth. There wasn't a person here who hadn't been broken by life one way or another. But there was only one crazy person here. You and I would make excellent victims, he said almost affectionately to the madman. James knew what was happening this minute: Sophia locking the door from the outside. Who, us? It would have been clear to anyone long ago. Caracourt still didn't understand. You and me, James explained to him. Your master has been waiting for you for a long time. He ran his hand along the walls. Old wood, how glorious it will burn. But it doesn't work like that. It's not time for me to go to the bonfire yet. The Caracourt's voice was already hysterical. James tried the torch on the towel over there, or on the robe hanging on the nail. The Caracourt rushed to the door, but James blocked his way. At first he thought it was sparks spraying from his eyes, but then he saw something out the window he'd never seen here before: the flashing beacons on police cars. Caracourt was beating on the locked door with both palms and screaming. James, on the other hand, stood with his torch down, barely able to keep his feet. He closed his eyes, relief making him want to cry. A bankrupt rich man came to visit his mother, who was abandoned in the middle of nowhere 5 years ago. And as he approached, that night, Walter's dreams were so vivid that when he woke up, he thought, That's it. I'm drunk. I'm hallucinating. His head rattled so much that he had no strength to get out of bed. The man rolled over onto his side with difficulty and slowly got up. There were pills somewhere. He pulled out the nightstand drawer, fumbled inside with his hand to dissolve the pill in a glass of water. Walter drank and lay down again. He dreamt of his father that night. He was angry with his son, swearing and shouting. But what he did to his mother. You're selfish and mean, his father said. And Walter stood in front of him as he had years before, as a child, and did not look up. Mother spent her whole life raising you, denied herself an extra dress. And you, the dream was so explicit that Walter could almost physically feel the slap his father had given him. It was at this moment that his mother had to stand up for her son. She had always protected him from everyone, calmed his father when he was angry, defended him in front of his teachers at school, scolded the neighborhood kids, taking away his bicycle. Where is the mother? His father was getting more and more unruly. He was about to take off his belt and give Walter a beating. But Mum wasn't in the dream. She never came to save her son. And that realization made me feel cold inside. Fear gripped his whole body and cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Walter woke up covered in sweat. The man hadn't seen his mother in 5 years. Maybe she's dead, he thought, and that thought made his head crack even harder. Walter slowly looked around the room. Slowly he began to remember everything that had happened the day before. The bailiffs had shown up at the office yesterday with a notice that Walter no longer owned the firm, his accounts were seized, and he had to leave the flat within 10 days. What the fuck are you guys doing? Walter raged. It's get the hell out of here or I'll call security. The man reached for the phone to dial the number of the head of security, but the uniformed man held out an ordinance to him. What's this? What are you pulling at me? Your paperwork's failing. Walter was confused as he read what was printed on the white sheet of paper. The paper stated that the new owner of the firm was Monica Kravchenko. Wait, the man said in a more peaceful tone. Can I call the owner of this Monica who is in the paper here? I'll try to find out everything. I know her. Please, the man in uniform said indifferently. Just do your best. We won't be here long. Walter frantically dialed Monica's number, not understanding what had happened or why she owned his firm. This is some kind of misunderstanding, he thought. For a moment, the man thought he was being pranked, like on a famous TV show. Now the door will open and a film crew will come in. Everyone will shout it's a prank. A polite voice is heard in the receiver. The subscriber is temporarily unavailable. Shit, Walter cursed. You can only take your personal belongings. Everything else must stay in the office. And seeing that his attempts to reach the new owner had failed, the bailiff pointed to the door. Please. Still uncomprehending, the man headed for the door. On his way out, he mumbled, I'll call the lawyers, I'll sort it all out. This is a misunderstanding. It's your right. The uniformed man replied calmly, locking the door behind Walter. Have a good day. Leaving the office, Walter dialed George's number. George was a childhood friend. George. We need to meet, the man said when his mate's voice came through the phone. I'm in trouble. No problem, Brother George replied. Where and when? Let's meet at our bar on the seafront. Get there as soon as you can. All right? I will. When George walked through the door, Walter had almost emptied the bottle of whiskey. Will you have a drink? He asked his friend, and without waiting for an answer, poured the rest into the glass. Goov, one more, and get something to eat. You've got a lot on your plate. Bro George looked at his friend critically. What's the occasion? You won't believe this. I got kicked out of my own office today. And they said my accounts are blocked, and I have to get out of my flat within 10 days. So you see, they kicked you out of your own firm and won't let you back into your flat, George replied calmly. He sipped from his glass and took a bite of lemon slices. Everything seemed fine with you, no problems. I don't understand it either, Walter said in a stammering voice. But the main thing, mate, you don't know the most important thing. They showed me a paper that says I'm no longer the owner of the company, but the new owner. Who do you think? George looked with interest at his friend, who was already pouring from the bottle brought by the waiter. The man drank the whiskey, emptied the glass completely, trying to concentrate his gaze, looked into his mate's eyes. The new owner of the firm is Monica Kravchenko. He said these words sarcastically, slowly, deliberately stretching each syllable so that George would understand faster. You're Monica? George seemed surprised. How so? Did you sign the firm over to her? Are you stupid or what? It's enough that you provide for her with her boutique spas, foreign resorts. I wouldn't have thought of that. Then how did she come to own your firm and your flat? George had a drink too. I know. Walter slammed his fist on the table, drawing the attention of the other bar patrons. The guard at the door tensed up, stretching, ready to throw the rowdy customer out the door. Let's ask her. He took out his smartphone and dialed Monica's number, which was marked as favored in his contacts. But the caller was still unavailable. No answer, bitch. The man swore. How about the spa? George suggested. That's where the girls usually switch their phones off. Damn it, Walter poured the glasses again. In the morning, he could hardly remember everything that happened afterwards, seeing that he'd had too much to drink. To avoid unnecessary trouble, the guard asked the friends to leave. Walter was indignant, trying to fight with the security guard. George persisted in dragging him into the air. He was assisted in this by the guard. George shoved Walter into the taxi and got in the front seat himself. Walter didn't remember anything else. Walter woke up in his bed with the realization that it was no longer his own. He slapped his bare feet on the floor. The man stalked into the kitchen, hoping there was something to drink in the fridge. George, that's the kind of friend you are. You could have supplied me with something for my hangover, Walter thought, unable to find anything that would help his health. Sighing heavily, he headed for the shower to get some relief and get back to normal. The jets of water were refreshing. For a moment, Walter's memory told him that the bailiff's paperwork had not mentioned his car. I'm going to go see Monica. Let her tell me how she so cleverly took over my firm, the man thought, drying himself with a fluffy towel. He hastily drank a cup of coffee, pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, and left the flat. There was no car in the yard. Walter remembered that he had left it outside the office. When he took a taxi to the office center, he was happy to see that his Jeep was parked in the car park. From the car, the man decided to call the office. Yes, Walter, the friendly voice of Mandy's secretary, answered the phone. "Is anyone in my office?" "No, I'm in the waiting room. No one's come in," she answered. "And when will you be here?" Without answering the girl's question, he asked another. "Has Monica been in?" "No," I said. "No one's here." "All right, work. Anyway, listen, close everything up and go home. Get some rest. I'll call you later when there's news." The man turned the key in the ignition and drove out of the car park. He was determined. Now this bitch will explain everything. She'll tell me everything. I trusted her like I trusted myself. How did she manage to pull this on me? The Jeep flew down the avenue, overtaking cars, trolleybuses, buses. Walter imagined Monica telling him, "Honey, it was just a joke and everything would fall back into place." Entering the entrance of the house where his mistress lived, Walter pressed the button for the lift. But the lift was still not coming. He stood for a while and decided to climb the stairs to the 8th floor. The bell to the girl's flat rang with a cheerful trill. No one answered. Walter pressed the button again. Finally, the door opened. Monica stood on the threshold. "You, what are you doing here?" she asked. But Walter pushed her away and walked inside. "You tell me what you're doing." "Yesterday I found out that you've taken over my company and my flat and embezzled my bank accounts." The man went into the living room. Monica followed him leisurely, wrapping up her dressing gown. "Why aren't you saying anything? Why are you flapping your eyes at me?" The girl looked at Walter confusedly, with fear in her eyes. Suddenly the door to the bedroom opened and George came out. Now confusion appeared in Walter's eyes. "It's you. What are you doing here?" he asked his friend. "I was asleep, as you see," he replied. "Why here?" Walter still didn't understand. George went to the bar, took out a bottle of wine and 3 glasses. He opened it slowly and, pouring the red liquid, handed 1 glass to Monica and sipped from the other. "Shall we drink?" He nodded at the glass. "I'm driving," Walter replied. The absurdity of the situation kept him from realizing what was happening. But he was beginning to realize the worst of it. His best friend was sleeping with his girlfriend, and his girlfriend had somehow robbed him of everything he had earned over the past years. "Will you explain something to me?" Walter plopped down on the couch, folded his arms across his chest, and prepared to listen to his lover and his friend's explanations. "I'm asking both of you," he raised his voice, glancing at George and the girl. "Don't you yell," George told him calmly. "Not at home. In fact, you don't even have a home anymore. Monica owns the flat as well as the firm. So it's not in your best interest to make a fuss here. If you behave well, we'll leave you some money for the first time," said George. "You will? You'll leave me some?" Walter jumped up from the couch, grabbed George by the neck, and started to shake him. But the man pushed him with such force that he was instantly back where he had been. Walter wrapped his arms around his head. Everything that was happening seemed like a terrible dream, a nightmare, a delusion. "So you're the one who pulled this off and left me with nothing." It finally dawned on Walter that this was no joke, no prank. "What do you think?" George asked wryly. "Monica wouldn't do such a thing. She's not very clever, as you know, but she has many other talents." "Yes, Monica." George put his arm round the girl's waist and held her close to him. He looked victorious next to Walter, who was devastated after last night's binge, humiliated. "How could you, George? We've been friends since we were kids," Walter asked in a quiet voice. "Friends?" George let go of Monica and walked over to Walter, who was sitting on the couch. He leaned over him, his gaze angry and prickly. "Is that what friends do? You always acted like a king, always taking the best for yourself. I had to make do with what was left. You had the best girls, the best clothes. Your parents even gave you a car freshman year. I was always your shadow, always rushing to your aid when you were whining, George, help. Like yesterday, I came to you as soon as you called. Only that was the last time. Saying something like that? Walter tried to get a word in edgewise. Shut up and listen. George cut him off. I'll be running the firm from now on. Monica is just a formality. Without her, I couldn't have gotten the business away from you. I mean, you were head over heels in love with her. Fool. But you've always been emotionally driven and you've never thought straight. You're also too young and overconfident. No, Walter, you have no sense of self-preservation. And in this day and age, you can't trust anyone. You hear me? Not even the woman who spends the night with you. And you're the one who likes to talk about your successes, George continued. So how much do you need for the first time? I'm not greedy. I can slip a few $1,000s from your old accounts. Fuck you, Walter got up from the couch, looked angrily at his former, now no longer friend. Then he looked at Monica. You're still a doormat, just like you were a doormat. You think he needs you? He'd trade you for another girl with longer legs. All right, that's enough. George interrupted Walter. Get out of here, get out of here. And I don't want to see you again. George pushed Walter towards the exit. Back in the flat, he took out his suitcase and began to pack. A black anger was ripening in the man's soul, developing a filth-stinking, nasty, unbearable filth. Rolling the suitcase into the hallway, Walter returned to the bedroom and opened the safe. It was a good thing he'd been smart enough to keep at least some cash. He put a few wads of money into the suitcase, opened the door and left the flat. The man had nowhere to go. He had been driving around the city for several hours, wondering if he could stay at a holiday resort on the bay. It was a good idea in itself, but Walter didn't want to be alone. He needed to talk, alone in nature. Only a bottle would do. Without noticing, Walter drove out of town. He remembered his nightmare. Why hadn't he dreamt about his mother? She always stood up for Walter when his father scolded him. The decision came naturally. He would go to the remote village where he had taken his mother 5 years ago. It was time to apologize for everything, to repent for getting rid of an aging woman, to live a life of pleasure, to fall to his knees and beg, plead, forgive him. Just so long as Mum was alive. Walter's mother, Tiffany, was originally from Vermont. Her parents lived in a lakeside village near a nature preserve. They worked on a ranch. Unlike other families that had 5 or 6 children, Tiffany's parents did not have many children. After giving birth to a daughter, Tiffany's mother underwent a complicated surgery and was unable to have any more children. The father, who had always wanted multiple sons, accepted it, but Tiffany grew up surprisingly docile. She helped her father and mother with everything. She carried water, stacked firewood, weeded the vegetable garden. Gradually, her father even began to take her hunting and fishing. Her mother tried to teach her the wisdom of cooking. On long winter evenings, they spun, knitted and sewed warm clothes together: socks, mittens, hats, waistcoats. When Tiffany finished 9 grades, she was ready to leave for New York. The village slowly began to die out. The young people were moving away. Houses were falling into disrepair, left without owners. Having settled in the cities, the children took the elderly parents to their homes. When Tiffany's mother heard of her daughter's plans, she pleaded, "Daughter, how can we be without you? Who will bring us a glass of water in our old age? I'll go to college or university, finish, get a job and help you," Tiffany replied. "And my mother is right," said my father. "There's really nothing for girls to do here. I heard the other day they're closing the post office. We'll be traveling 40 miles for our pensions. Let her go, God willing, she'll do well and everything will be all right." Having reconciled, the mother helped her to pack her daughter's things, and on the appointed day, she and her father took her in a pickup truck to the railway station. A month later, they received a telegram. "Mum, Dad, I got into college." Tears came to the mother's eyes. Her father comforted her. "Tiffany's not stupid. She'll learn. She'll become a man. Maybe she'll take us with her." "Where can we go, Father?" "To New York," sobbed her mother. "Where would we go from our farm?" Tiffany was used to city life. After graduating from college, Tiffany got a job at a factory in the personnel department. That's where she met her husband. He was a foreman on the shop floor. For more than a year, the man courted the girl. He was 10 years older. So Tiffany was very shy of this grown man. But he was persistent, and after a year and a half, Tiffany and Stephen got married, playing a modest wedding. And after 3 more years, the works department gave the young family a flat. That's when they began to think about having children. But the years flew by, and Tiffany didn't get pregnant. Doctors said that she was completely healthy and did not understand the reason for the couple's childlessness. 10 years had passed since Tiffany had left her home village, moved away from her parents, and she was constantly writing letters to them. Dad and Mom answered them. But she couldn't go and visit her family. New York, with its frantic pace of life, wouldn't let her go. And yet Tiffany returned to the village. Only the occasion was not a happy one. One day she received a telegram from her father that her mother had died. Taking time off work, she and her husband bought train tickets and traveled to the funeral the same day. As they walked through the village streets to their home, Tiffany was struck by how different everything was. The windows of the ramshackle houses were boarded up. There were no flowering plants in the front gardens, and the cows and chickens could not be heard mooing in the yards. The village was dying. A few neighbors, mostly old men and women, stood at the gate of her father's house, black shawls tied around their heads. Tiffany walked into the house. On a stool stood the coffin in which her mother lay. The young woman cried as she crouched down beside it. She stroked her mother's head, her hands, gazing into her dead, peaceful expression. It was as if Mum was sound asleep. Only from that sleep there would never again be an awakening. After the wake, when the neighbors had dispersed, Tiffany and Stephen remained seated at the table with their father. "That's it, daughter. Our mum's gone," the man said softly. "She was ill. That's understandable. It's just a pity she didn't get to see her grandchildren." "Daddy, we can't have boys," Tiffany complained. She noticed her husband's reproachful look and lowered her eyes. "Do the doctors say they're just throwing up their hands?" Dad asked. "They say we're both healthy," she shrugged her shoulders. "Apparently our time has not yet come to become parents." "It's not the time," sighed the father. "Sins do not give." "What are our sins, Daddy?" Tiffany got excited. "Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Sin is a multi-generational thing. You don't hear its reverberations right away. But you should repent for the sins of your ancestors." "Well, it's time to go to bed. I'll go close up the cattle, and you make yourselves comfortable. We'll talk in the morning." And in the morning the father woke up the sleeping couple and took his daughter and son-in-law to the forest. They walked for a long time along a narrow path until they came to a waterfall, a turbulent stream of water jets falling down from a high rock, creating an iridescent fountain of splashes in the sunlight. The spray played with different colors, flying in a fine trot in all directions. In the bowl at the foot of the waterfall, the water calmed down, allowing me to see the reflection of my face, slightly distorted by the movement of the water. "Take off your clothes," Father ordered. "Dip yourself in the water 3 times and cross yourself." "Am I not baptized?" Stephen tried to object, to whom the whole ritual seemed like nonsense. "Just say, 'Forgive me, Lord,'" the man said firmly, stroking his gray beard. "He might hear you. We're not Christians." Tiffany and Stephen went down to the waterfall bowl and did as their father had instructed. They walked home in silence, each thinking about something different. At dinner, Father said, "The old people used to say, if someone dies in a family and a child appears in the same year, it means that God has forgiven the sins of the deceased. God is merciful. He will forgive our mum and give you children." Stephen looked at his father-in-law in surprise. Tiffany only spoke, "God willing, Daddy, God willing." A month later, the woman found out she was pregnant. And in May, she and her husband had a beautiful baby boy, Walter. The couple was happy they couldn't get enough of the baby. The joy of the birth of a son overshadowed the death of Tiffany's father. The news that came from the neighbors, already after the funeral of the man, for 10 years of childless life they managed to save money. Therefore, immediately after the birth of their son, Tiffany and Stephen bought a cooperative 2-room flat in a new building, in which a separate room was allocated for Walter. Stephen quickly sobered up from the euphoria of becoming a father. He tried to teach his son to work hard, be responsible, and stand up for himself. But Tiffany continued to nurse him like a hen. "You're too hard on your son," Stephen, she told her husband, who made her 3-year-old son take out the bin. "He is still very young. It's nothing, he can lift a cup. but will he carry the bucket away? On weekends, his father dragged his son to the park for a jog, made him do push-ups and pull-ups on the bar. And when he was 5 years old, he gave him to a boxing class. However, after the first bruise received by his son at the training, his mother flatly refused to take the child to boxing. "Do you want to make your only son an invalid?" She objected to her husband's arguments that the boy should grow up to be a man. Stephen was madly in love with his wife. It was difficult for him to argue with her. The man tried to avoid the slightest cause for quarrel, so in most cases Tiffany was able to win the right to bring up her son as she wanted. Walter was never denied anything. The best toys, a bicycle, beautiful things bought in brand-name shops, all this was taken for granted. Walter was not a stupid boy, though. At school, he studied for a solid 4. Teachers praised the bright pupil, but his discipline was lousy. With his friend George, who lived in the next door, they were always inventing new pranks. One day they bought a rat from a pet shop and put it in the teacher's desk drawer. When she opened it to take out her notebook, she nearly fainted. The mother was summoned to the principal's office. Blushing, she apologized for her son and promised that she would have a very serious talk with him at home. The next day, Walter and George broke a window in the teacher's lounge by throwing a basketball at it. Tiffany had to tell her husband. The principal strictly ordered that new glass be put into the window frame immediately, but the woman herself could not do it. As punishment, Walter was banned from the yard for a week. During spring break, he sat at home, looking out the window as the boys played in the yard. Still, Tiffany's son's childhood was no worse than other children's. In the 9th grade, Walter was given a moped for his birthday. At the end of the first year of the institute, his father bought him a new car. Parents loved their son with all their hearts, and no matter how hard they tried to bring him up in strictness, paid for his growing needs. After graduating from the economics department of the institute, the boy got a job in a large trading firm. "I'm not going to work for my uncle all my life," he told his parents. "Here I will gain experience, learn how everything is actually arranged there. I'll open my own firm." Father by that time had already retired, but continued to work, having traveled a long professional path from a simple worker to the master of the shop, and then the head of production. He thought that trade was not a serious business. The man repeatedly persuaded his son to go to work at the plant in the planning and economic department, but he only waved him away. "Here is your factory, the last century," said Walter. "The future is in business." Dad just shook his head. He thought that business was all about bandits, while an honest man should work for the good of his country. He himself lived like that until the last day, every morning passing through the factory gate. Walter's father passed away without giving anyone long suffering and agony. One day he fell asleep and never woke up. He died quietly, in his sleep. Walter turned 30 years old that year. After his father's funeral, Walter felt he was in charge of the family and felt it was his time to make decisions. He left the firm, sitting in his room in front of his computer 24 hours a day. Then one day he said to his mother, "I know you and your father had savings. I've decided to start my own firm and I want to ask you for money." "How much do you need?" Tiffany asked. "The more the better. I need to rent an office, buy office equipment, but I also need money for the first batch of goods," Walter replied. "I'll give it to you." "Sure, son," agreed his mother, who was not used to refusing Walter. A year later, Walter was already the director of a trading company, which did not bring super profits but worked quite successfully. The staff was a few dozen employees, which son Tiffany paid salaries on time, and especially enterprising even encouraged bonuses and trips to seaside resorts. And he was in no hurry to return the money his mother had given him to start the business. Tiffany didn't ask him to. She was happy that her son was doing what he loved and that he was good at it. As time went on, and one day Walter came home and told his mother, "I'm bringing a girl over tonight, so make us something for dinner." Tiffany smiled. She had been waiting for her son to marry for a long time, but there was no one in their house except his friend George, with whom they had been inseparable since childhood, and suddenly Walter would bring a girl. Maybe they'll even announce that they're getting married. Tiffany would be sure to bless the young couple so that all would be well in their lives. She really wanted to babysit her grandchildren. Her son is in his 30s, and he's not even thinking about kids. Walter met Monica at a club. A spectacular girl in a short, tight dress, immediately attracted the attention of the guy. Bright, with a defiant look. She was the kind of girl they say pretty devil. She sat behind the bar and slowly sipped her cocktail. "Do you miss me?" Walter asked and sat down next to her. The girl looked at him with an appraising gaze. Apparently she liked the young man, decently dressed, attractive, and when he pulled his wallet out of his pocket, took out a large note and handed it to the bartender, saying, "I'll have a whiskey and the girl will have whatever she's drinking." The pretty girl smiled white-hot. Walter, the man, introduced himself. "Monica," the girl said, stretching her name slightly. "I mean here alone." "What are you interested in?" The girl was obviously flirting with her new acquaintance. "Very serious," Walter said, and put his palm on Monica's waist. "Be careful," she warned him. "I might hurt you." How could such a sweet, charming girl offend a poor, lonely guy? I wouldn't believe it. Walter tried to make a joke. "Here's to introductions," he drank, pushed the glass away from him, and said to the bartender mate, "Do it again." Monica, sipping her cocktail leisurely, looked at the man. "Are you alone?" the girl asked. "Not exactly. My friend and I agreed to meet here, to have a little fun, and all that work and work," answered Walter, calculating the next portion of whiskey. "So I'm the third extra?" Monica made a jokingly sad expression on her face. "Where does poor Walter work that he's so tired?" "Poor Walter works at his own firm." "Wait, what's poor Walter?" "He's not poor. He's a very rich man." He started to flounder a bit. "There's my friend George." George came to the counter. Walter introduced George to his new girlfriend, and the group moved into the lounge and took a table. Walter found himself liking Monica more and more, and this liking grew in proportion to the drink. The club was already closing when the group poured out into the street. Monica put her arms around Walter's neck and whispered, "Would you like to continue the evening?" "I'd love to," Walter mumbled. "Then let's go back to my place." "Do you have a drink?" she asked, pulling him close to her by his slim waist. "Do you have any?" Walter spent the night at Monica's, and in the morning, barely able to get his head off the pillow, decided to call George. He had to get home somehow, and George hadn't had much to drink last night. Might as well pick him up brotherly. The phone rang with long beeps. No one answered. "You're up, sweetheart." "Good morning." Monica stretched sweetly in bed. She reached over to the bedside table, where a bottle of champagne stood. She poured it into a glass, drank it, and handed it to Walter. "Want some?" "It'll give you a headache." Monica waved her head, tossing her hair over the pillow. "Don't you have anything stronger?" Walter asked. "Come on, anyway." "There's no ride home," he agreed. "What about a taxi? Or do you just not want to go?" Monica wagged her finger at him. Walter fell into the hottie's arms. Finally, tearing themselves away from each other, they lay silent, breathing heavily. Walter was the first to break the silence. "I'm kind of hungry. Should I cook something to eat?" No cooking. "I hate the cooker and everything that goes with it," she said flatly. "Why don't we go out and have lunch?" "Where?" "A restaurant, for example." "Let's do that." Walter decided that this wonderful night must have a beautiful ending. "I'll just make one phone call," he said. "Okay. I'm going to take a shower." Wrapped in a sheet, Monica stalked down the corridor. Tiffany was in a hurry to get home from work. She had to run to the shop to buy cheese and sausage. Today her son would bring his girlfriend to meet her. That thought made her happy. Surely this girl from his work. She's probably smart, kind, and very pretty. There's no other way around it. Her boy won't go out with just anyone. After changing her clothes, the housewife put on an apron and began to prepare dinner. She sent the chicken, carefully marinated since the morning, into the oven and began to prepare the appetizers. In the living room, she spread a beautiful tablecloth on the table and arranged the dishes and utensils. Tiffany was almost ready when the doorbell rang. She hurried into the hallway. "Mum, we're here." Walter greeted her mother cheerfully, kissing her on the cheek. "This is Monica." "Pleased to meet you," the woman replied, looking at the girl with a smile. She looked nothing like the image Tiffany had painted in her mind of her future daughter-in-law, bright, tall, and wearing a short skirt. "I'm Tiffany," she introduced herself. The girl smiled silently back. She looked around the spacious hallway with interest. "Why are we standing here?" "Come into the hall," Tiffany invited her son and his girlfriend. "I'll be right there." The woman went into the kitchen, while Monica continued to turn her head from side to side. "Nice place you have here. Do you live here alone?" "Yes, my father died and it's just me and my mum," Walter said, uncorking a bottle of champagne. "Why don't you get married?" the girl asked. "It had never occurred to me. Maybe I haven't met the one I want to spend my life with," replied the man. "Are you sure? Or maybe your mum doesn't let you?" Monica laughed, and Walter looked at her, not knowing whether she was joking or seriously considering him a mama's boy. "Stop it. I have a great mum," he hugged the girl. Tiffany came into the room. When she saw the young people, she was a little confused. "Well, everything is ready. We can sit down at the table." The woman had a dish with fried chicken in her hands. "It smells so good, Mummy." Walter wiggled his nose. "I love it when you bake chicken with your signature recipe." "Thank you, son," Tiffany replied. Wanting to lighten the mood a little, she turned to Monica. "What do you, Monica, like to cook? Can you share a recipe?" Monica looked at the woman, then at Walter. "I don't like to cook anything," she replied. "I prefer to eat in restaurants or, at the very least, order takeout." It was Tiffany's turn to be surprised. "How can you do that? How are you going to feed your husband and children? After all, we all know the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. That wisdom works, believe me." "So you married Walter's dad because of your chicken frying skills?" Monica asked, not the least bit embarrassed, reaching for the salad. Tiffany stopped chewing for a moment. She thought the question was downright rude and insensitive. The smile slowly slid off the woman's face. She looked at Monica, who was putting on the salad, not noticing that she had said something wrong. Sensing the awkwardness of the situation, Walter tried to gloss over it. "Mummy," Monica wanted to say that you are a very good cook, and Daddy just couldn't help but fall in love with such a good hostess. He looked at Monica. She nodded her head. "Yes, that's what I was going to say," she said, still chewing. The dinner conversation did not go well. After tea and cake, Walter and Monica left. "I'll see Monica off and come back," he kissed his mother on the cheek. She continued to clear the dishes from the table. She did not say goodbye to her guest, showing her displeasure with her son's choice. When the son returned home, Tiffany was about to go to bed. She took a sedative. The woman couldn't get over Walter's girlfriend. She seemed rude, defiant. She was nothing like Tiffany had imagined her future daughter-in-law to be. "Mama, are you still awake?" Walter asked, peering into his mother's bedroom. "No, son," she sighed. "Your friend made my blood pressure skyrocket, and I had to take medicine." "Mom, why do you have to make things so complicated?" The man was indignant. Monica's a normal, modern girl. If she doesn't want to stand at the cooker, she doesn't have to. Nowadays, you can really order ready meals, and the laundry can be delivered to the laundrette. Specially trained people can clean the house too. Why bother? Is it not normal that a woman wants to be beautiful and well-groomed, not tortured by constant cooking, laundry, and cleaning? "Do you think I'm tortured?" Tiffany asked. "Yes, all the years I took care of your father. He always had clean, ironed shirts, and he was always well-fed, and the delicious dumplings we used to make together. Don't you remember? And this one of yours probably has no idea how normal people make dumplings, pies, or where clean linen comes from in the cupboard." "Mom, this is my choice in my life." Walter tried to argue with his mother. "She doesn't want anything from you but money. Look at her. She's dressed like Tiffany almost swore, though she wasn't in the habit of doing that. I'm sorry, God. If your father had seen that tarnished, tastelessly dressed and ill-mannered girl. Here we go. I'm going to bed. I have to get up early tomorrow," said Walter. He walked out of his mother's bedroom, closing the door behind him. Tiffany sat at the dressing table for a while longer, looking at her face in the mirror. Since her husband's death, she had visibly deteriorated. Her face showed signs of fatigue. Maybe I should retire, she thought. It wasn't the first time Tiffany had thought it was time to stop working. Her health was failing more and more. Her eyesight was getting worse. Then there were the computers that now had to be mastered. Tiffany was having a hard time. The younger generation, on the other hand, was getting up to speed and not afraid to work with any software. It's decided I'll talk to the boss tomorrow. If there is a candidate to take my place, I'll make way for the young people and go on a well-deserved holiday, she decided. Walter's mood was high. His trading company was 1 year old. As director and owner, he could see the results. Profits were growing. There were more and more partners, and the accounts were finally beginning to show a substantial amount of money. On this occasion, the man decided to thank his employees and organize a party. The staff took the news with enthusiasm. It was decided to free the meeting room, decorate it, and order catering with snacks, drinks, and dishes from the restaurant. On the appointed day, everyone gathered to celebrate the firm's anniversary. George and Monica were also invited. Dear friends, colleagues, Walter addressed the audience. I am happy that we are celebrating the first birthday of our company. I would like to thank you for believing in the success of our business from day one and doing everything to make it grow, bring us success and profit. Thank you. The people applauded loudly. I had no idea that your employees loved and respected you so much, Monica said, hugging Walter around the neck. All evening she had been showing that she was directly related to the director, that she was not just his girlfriend but his favorite girl. Monica had far-reaching plans for Walter. Except his mother Tiffany might be a problem. The other day, Walter gave Monica a luxurious fur coat. However, the gift was not bought on the man's initiative. They were driving through town, and Monica saw a fur store. She asked to come in because she really likes beautiful fur coats and mantos. The man was unable to object. The girl drove him crazy, and he could not give up his love adventures with Monica. Laving between the racks of coats and mantos, the girl tried on one or the other. At last she came out to Walter, who was drinking coffee on a sofa, spinning round and round. The blue mink coat was very much to the face of the tall and slender Monica. But the price tag that dangled from the sleeve confused Walter. Honey, Monica pouted with greasy scarlet lipstick. Don't I deserve such a gift from you? Look at something else, darling. And preferably this number should be 1 less 0, the man suggested. No, I want this one. It suits me very well. Don't you think it's a little overpriced? It's overpriced. In Europe, you can buy much cheaper. Walter tried to dissuade the girl from buying it. But Monica stood her ground. The man had to agree. Wrap it up, he said to the saleswoman, slightly damaging his mood. Prevented Walter from rejoicing in the renewal together with Monica, but very soon the girl was able to lift his spirits by dragging him to her house. He returned home at midnight. The morning coffee, prepared by Tiffany, was invigorating and set him up for work. Walter stepped out of the shower and joined his mother. The woman carefully tossed her son a plate of sandwiches. Did you get home late last night? Did you have to work late? She asked Walter. No, he answered briefly. Where were you then? Walter put the cup on the table, hesitated for a moment, then answered in an irritated tone. Mum, what am I, 5 years old? Are you going to control me all my life? Where I want to be, I'll be there. When I want, then I come. What do you care? Calm down, Tiffany said. I was just wondering, Tiffany said. She was startled. Her son had never let her raise her voice before. It's just that you usually tell me how you spend your time with George, she added. Walter got up from the table, leaving the cup with the unfinished coffee. I'm out of here. Lots of work, sorry, he said, and turned around, leaving the kitchen. He didn't even kiss his mother goodbye. The conversation hadn't gone well, and the morning wasn't going well. In fact, Tiffany wanted to tell her son about her decision to take a well-deserved retirement. The day before, she'd talked to the head of human resources at the plant. And it turned out she'd been wanting her niece to take Tiffany's place for a long time. But only she was shy to say, because Tiffany had worked at the same place all her life and was honored by the bosses. The issue had resolved itself in a fortnight. The woman would be retiring, giving way to a new generation. Now she wondered how her son would react. Surely he would be pleased. Tiffany was already making plans. First, she wanted to buy a trip to a sanatorium. She'd wanted to go to Karlovy Vary in the Czech Republic for a long time. True, she would have to ask Walter to pay back some of the money she had lent him a year ago to start a business. But her son was apparently doing well, and he would give her the money. And then, when she got back from her trip, she'd renovate the flat. It will be necessary to hire a good team of workers to do everything qualitatively and quickly. And in the renovated flat, she would be able to live out her life. That was Tiffany's plan as she planned to leave work. But that evening, Walter didn't come home again. After work, he went to Monica's house, taking her favorite champagne on the way. After a pleasant time, they lay cuddled together. "Walter," the girl murmured. "How about it?" What he said. "Will you marry me?" "What do you mean yours? Yes or no?" She whispered caressingly in his ear. "I will," Walter answered. "When?" Monica persisted. "Tomorrow, isn't it?" Walter finally came to his senses and looked at the girl. "Are we that bad or what?" he asked. Monica reached over to the nightstand for a packet of cigarettes. "I knew it," she said resentfully. "I knew you were just like all men. You come to me, and then you marry some gray mouse." "What made you think that?" the man asked, opening the window to light a cigarette. "If you wanted to marry me, you would have proposed already. What am I, a girl for an hour or something?" "Don't talk nonsense," Walter said. "Don't I give you money? I don't buy you presents. I don't fulfill your wishes." "That's all right. But a wife is something else. If a man marries, he proves his love. You love me, don't you?" "I do." "All right, if that's the way you want it, we'll get married." He put out his cigarette. "Then come to me, my little cat." Walter couldn't resist Monica. A few days later, he picked Monica up after work and they went to his house to tell Tiffany that they were getting married. To mark the occasion, the girl wore a new fur coat Walter had bought her. Let his mother see that he spared nothing for her. Tiffany wasn't expecting any guests. She wasn't feeling well today. Her blood pressure spiked and she had to take some medicine. She lay on the sofa in the living room and turned on the television softly. When she heard the sound of the door opening in the hallway, she didn't get up. She knew it was her son. "Mom, you're home. We're home," shouted Walter from the hallway, helping Monica out of her outerwear. Realizing that her son had not returned alone, Tiffany got up from the couch. Walter and Monica entered the room. "Hi, were you resting or something?" the man asked. "Yeah, I wasn't feeling well," the mother replied. "Hello, Tiffany." Monica tried to appear polite, but still caused negative emotions in Tiffany, which she could hardly hide. "Hello, Monica. Come on in." "I'll put the kettle on." The woman went into the kitchen, but Monica beat her to it. "Don't worry, sit down, rest, I'll do it myself," Monica said. "Yes, Walter, go ahead." He lightly slapped her just below her back. But Tiffany noticed his gesture and wrinkled her nose, disliking the girl even more. When everyone was seated at the table, Monica elbowed Walter in the side. She couldn't wait for him to tell her mother that they were getting married soon. "Mom, Monica and I have something we want to tell you." Walter began, trying to keep his tone solemn, but he hesitated a little. "Why are you slowing down, Walter?" said the girl loudly and clearly, not waiting for the groom to make up his mind to announce the news. "Tiffany, we're getting married." Tiffany sighed and stared into her teacup. "Oh, and yet the contagion is unapologetic," she thought. "Yes, Mum, tomorrow we'll go and apply at the registry office. There are some people we know there, so we won't have to wait long. I think we can get married in a month." "What's the rush? Is she pregnant?" The woman nodded towards Monica, not even wanting to say her name. "Are you crazy?" The girl was indignant. "I'm pregnant." "Well, no, that's not me. It's just that usually those who are in such a hurry are those who have noticed a baby in their sin. Normal people prepare for a wedding deliberately, thinking about every step, Tiffany said calmly and judiciously. Walter, have you heard? According to your mother, we're not normal people. I'm shocked. Walter, why aren't you saying anything? Monica echoed loudly. Keep it down, please, Walter's mother asked. I have a terrible headache. Mom, it's what we decided, said the man calmly. It's out of the question. We came with Monica to tell you the news first. Thank you for that, sighed the mother. She sipped her tea, took a candy from the vase and slowly unwrapped the wrapper. Aren't you glad? Don't you have anything more to say? I'm glad when you're happy. That's all I can tell you, Tiffany replied. But since you come to me with news, I have something to tell you. The couple stared at the woman in surprise. Taking another bite of her chocolate candy, Tiffany finished her tea. As of Monday, I'm taking a well-deserved holiday. I've decided that I've had enough of working, and it's time to take a break, she said. Congratulations, Mum. It's about time, Walter exclaimed. Wait, don't interrupt me and listen, the mother continued, looking into her son's eyes. First of all, I want you to know that I want to have a healthy holiday. That's why I plan to buy a trip to Karlovy Vary. There is good air, mineral springs, all conditions for treatment of my arthritis and hypertension. That's great. I support this idea and I'm happy for you, Walter replied. While I'm in the Czech Republic, I'll need to renovate my flat, Tiffany continued. So I've decided to hire a team of decorators and have them do it right, so I don't have to think about how to fix it up later. I think it'll be enough to last me a lifetime. Walter looked round the kitchen. The flat really should have been renovated a long time ago. Especially nowadays, everything was done with beautiful, modern materials. And if they brought in a designer, they could make a luxury flat out of their 3-bedroom. In that connection, Walter, I'd like to ask you to return the money I gave you for your business. I'm going to need it now, Tiffany said. Walter looked up and stared at his mother. Monica looked at her lover in surprise. It was obvious that he was confused. His mother's desire to get the money back came as a surprise to the man. To be honest, he had already forgotten, thanks to whom he was able to start so successfully and turn the firm, as they call it, from scratch. I hope to get it next week, because I have to pay for the trip and give a deposit to the construction team, the mother added. The woman calmly finished her tea, pretending not to notice how puzzled her son was. Monica did not understand anything at all. Only one thing was clear to her: the wedding seemed to be on the verge of failure. It was not enough for the girl to sign and become Walter's wife. She dreamed of a lavish wedding with a museum restaurant and a huge number of guests. Monica was the first to break the silence in the kitchen. You know what, Tiffany? You should be ashamed to ask Walter for money. He's your own son, not a creditor. And besides, we have a big event coming up. Do you want us to celebrate our wedding in the dining room? Shut up, Walter said quietly. But Monica was unstoppable. You're old. You don't need much. Buy yourself a trip to a boarding house in Los Angeles County and relax for a month. You can renovate it in 2 or 3 years. What, do you have to have celebrities here so you can do a fancy renovation? Shut up, Monica. Walter tried to calm the girl down. No, Walter, I will not shut up. I'm your wife for 5 minutes, and therefore I have the right to decide where to spend your money. If I say there's going to be a wedding, there's going to be a wedding, or you'll never see me again. The girl literally jumped from the table, quickly dressed and slammed the door. Walter tried to rush after her, but Tiffany stopped him abruptly. Sit down, I haven't finished, she said. Confused, the man slumped back in his chair. That's a lot of money, he said. You have to be warned about such things in advance. This money is still in circulation. Soon we'll have to pay for another shipment of goods. It's not even one lorry, but several. Do you realize how much money that is? I have no idea, and I don't want to think about it, Tiffany said firmly. When you needed the money, I gave it to you with no terms or conditions. I was counting on your integrity. Now I need it, and I want it back without disrupting my plans. Mum, don't you care about my plans? Walter asked indignantly. I come to you, tell you I'm getting married, that Monica and I are going to celebrate the wedding in a restaurant. And you don't react to that? How am I supposed to react, son? It's your life, your decision. What does that have to do with me? Walter asked. What does it have to do with you? You should at least be happy and at most help me, Tiffany replied. No, my dear. Everything I had to do, I did for you. You're an adult. You're well into your 30s. So the word should doesn't apply to me now. It's up to you to look after, protect, and support your mother in her old age. Or do you have a different opinion? You're being unfair by denying me the opportunity to marry, Walter said sadly. I'm not stopping you. Marry whoever you want to marry. Give me the money. And let's end this pointless conversation. Tiffany left the kitchen and went to her bedroom. Walter sat there thinking. He was working out in his mind how to get out of this situation without arguing with his mother and Monica, and without losing profits at the firm. He did have to pay for another shipment of goods, and it was quite a large sum. He dialed Monica's number, deciding to go to her to discuss everything, and at the same time to stay at her place for the night. But she didn't answer the phone. She's offended, Walter thought. He switched off the kitchen light and left the flat. Getting into his car, the man headed for his mistress's house. The light in her window was on. Walter noticed this as he drove up to Monica's house. But when he rang the doorbell, no one answered. The man started pounding on the door with his fist. Monica, open up, we need to talk. Footsteps were heard outside the door. Walter breathed out a sigh of relief. What do you want? Monica asked through the door. Talk. We already did. I thought you were a man. Turns out you can't make up your mind without your mummy. Yes, I can, honey. Open up, Walter asked. The door opened softly. A man stepped into the hallway. Monica stood with her back against the wall, her lips down and her eyes on the floor. Her whole appearance showed how much she resented Walter and his mother. Well, aren't you sorry, honey? The man tried to hug her, but Monica pushed him away. Tell me, who do you want to live with, Mummy or me? Monica asked. Of course with you, my love, answered Walter. Then why don't you consider me at all? Do I have to get married in a dressing gown? And my guests will eat Olivier and potatoes with cutlets in the dining room. Don't worry, it won't happen. You just have to wait a little longer, Walter urged her. I don't want to wait. Can't your mother wait with her silly whims? Monica was indignant. I don't know, dear, but we'll think of something together. So he pulled the girl against him and quietly pushed her towards the bedroom. Monica gave in. She knew what strings Walter could pull. Then, lying in bed, they thought of a plan of action. Should we send your mother to a relative? Monica asked. Why? Walter didn't understand. To keep her out of the way. Don't you understand? Let her stay here. We'll have a wedding in the meantime. And when she gets here, you'll give her the money, or part of the debt. She doesn't even have any relatives, Walter puffed on his cigarette. She had relatives. Only her father and mother lived in a remote village, but they died a long time ago. I was just a kid. Where is this village? The mistress asked. Somewhere in Montana. And I didn't seem to go into much detail. Didn't her parents leave her daughter anything when she died? If there's no one else, she must have inherited something. Oh, please don't be ridiculous. What inheritance is there in a remote village? It's a small house, but it's probably rotten by now. My mother once went to my parents' grave and told me that almost all the houses in the village were abandoned. Everything was dead. Monica raised herself up on her elbows and looked carefully into Walter's eyes. There was triumph in her gaze. That's the way out, my dear, she whispered, smiling. Walter arrived home on time on the appointed day. Tiffany noticed that Walter was acting strangely, always trying to give her something. Then he called her to have tea together and talk. After the fight the other day, they'd hardly spoken. But apparently the son had come to his senses and realized that his mother was right. Walter poured the aromatic tea he'd brewed himself into cups and moved the sugar to Tiffany. How are things going at the firm, son? The woman asked. It's fine, as usual. We're working, making progress. You know we're not going backwards, Walter said, smiling. The mother thought his smile was strained, unnatural. "What do you do? Did you go to a travel agency?" Tiffany began to tell her, but her son interrupted her, asking for a clean hand towel. The woman went to her room, and he quickly pulled a vial from his pocket and dribbled it into his mother's cup. It was a sleeping pill. "Here you go." The mother handed Walter a towel. "Thank you, Mum. Now you can drink your tea in peace. You drink too." As they talked, the woman drank the whole cup and suddenly felt faint. She leaned against the wall. "I don't feel well, Walter," she said. But the man had already taken her in his arms and carried her into the room. He laid her on the sofa and hurried into the hallway to open the front door. "She's asleep." "Everything worked out?" Monica asked as she entered the flat. "Yes, I think she's asleep. We're in a hurry. We have to get there before she wakes up." Walter took his mother in his arms and Monica grabbed a blanket and pillow from the couch. They left the flat and walked down to the courtyard. The man put his mother in the back seat, placing a pillow under her head, and covered her with the blanket. Opening the boot, he threw in Tiffany's warm clothes that Monica had collected. Several bags of groceries stood nearby. Slamming the doors, Walter and Monica hit the road. As they pulled onto the motorway, Walter increased his speed. He drove as fast as he could, afraid that his mother would wake up and his and Monica's plan would fail. By 5 a.m., they reached the remote village where Tiffany had been born and raised. They found her parents' house. There was hardly any snow in town, but here it was knee-deep. Walter made his way to the gate and struggled to open it, and then the door to the house. He went back to the car, carried his mother into the hut, and put her on the bed. "Where should I put the groceries?" Monica asked. She was standing in the doorway holding the bags. "Over there on the table," Walter pointed. He covered the mother with a blanket and put a coat on top to keep her warm. "Let's go, Monica." They closed the door and drove away. They glimpsed abandoned houses with boarded-up shutters, lit by headlights. Tiffany woke up and felt terribly cold. She struggled to open her eyes. Her head hurt badly. She tried to get up, but fell back onto the bed, feeling completely powerless. "Where am I?" thought the woman. There were wooden walls all around. Faint daylight shone through the boarded-up windows. It took a while for Tiffany to realize that she was in her parents' house. But how she had come to be here, the woman didn't understand. The last thing she remembered was Walter giving her tea. And then darkness. "Masters, is anyone there?" There was a man's voice. There was a banging on the door. Tiffany tried to answer, but her tongue stuck to her mouth. "Hey," came another shout from outside. "I'm here," she said in a hoarse whisper. Her throat ached terribly. The door opened. A man with a gray beard, wearing a warm jacket and a winter hat, appeared on the threshold. When he saw the woman lying on the bed under some things, he rushed to her. "Who are you? What's the matter with you?" he asked Tiffany, patting her cheeks. "Are you all right?" "It's cold," she whispered. "Now wait, let me help you." The man grabbed a blanket, wrapped it around Tiffany, threw off his jacket and covered her with it, tucking it under her side. "How did you end up here? No one's been here in ages." She stared at him, unable to say a word. A man ran out of the house in a jumper. He was back in a minute. "I'll get some wood. I'll heat the stove. It'll be warm. You just put your head down for now. Wait a bit." In a few minutes, the wood was crackling in the stove. Tiffany could see the glow of scarlet flame through the crack in the door. The cooker was warped and wouldn't close tightly. "I see you've made a good home here. How much groceries did you bring?" Tiffany turned her head and saw the man looking at the bags on the table. She warmed up a little and began to come round. The woman realized that Walter had brought her here to keep her. She was against his wedding, and she demanded the money back. Meanwhile, the man had put a cloth rucksack on the table. "I'll pour you some hot tea. You'll warm up quickly," he said, and took a thermos out of the rucksack. He unscrewed the lid of the glass and poured the hot, aromatic drink into it. Taking a seat next to Tiffany on the bed, he helped her up, Here you go. It's delicious. Thank you. The woman took a few sips and thanked him. What's this? I make it myself. It's rosehip, hawthorn, and some other herbs. The man replied. Do you feel better? Yes, I'm almost completely warmed up. And I'm walking, looking at the tracks of a car. From it, footprints lead to the house, began to tell the stranger. No one has been in this house for ages, and now hello guests have arrived. So I thought I'd go in and check who had arrived. And here you are. Who are you? Tiffany asked. As she drank the hot tea, she felt invigorated. Her headache was gone. Oh, forgive me, you old fool. I forgot to introduce myself, the man apologized. I'm Oscar, the local forester. Oscar? How strange, Tiffany said thoughtfully. Why strange? The man didn't understand. Tiffany sat up on the bed. She felt the warmth of the house. The crackling logs in the cooker warmed not only her body but also her soul. She looked round the room. The colored wallpaper had almost completely fallen off the walls. The ceiling looked back at her. Old curtains were hanging from the windows. My mum made them when I was a girl. This is my home. You see, I grew up here, lived with my parents, then went to the city to study and stayed there. My daddy's name was Oscar. He was a forester in those days. Everyone in the neighborhood respected him. He was a very good man. Oscar listened in surprise at first, and then he laughed. So I'm a forester too. Oscar, like your father. What a coincidence. I never would have guessed. And of course I've heard that a very good man used to be a forester here. But I didn't know we were namesakes. Oscar laughed again. How did you end up here? Where are your relatives and friends? The car you came in? I saw the tracks. A Jeep or some other off-road vehicle? I don't know, Tiffany said sadly. I guess I don't have any family or loved ones anymore. The forester took her hand in his, noticing the sadness of her new acquaintance. Don't jump to conclusions. Things happen in life, he sighed tiredly. Then he squared his shoulders and spoke in a cheerful voice. If you've decided to stay here, you'll have to put the house in order. I'll help you. Do you mind? No, not at all. Tiffany smiled. Who wouldn't want help under these circumstances? Thank you. All day long, Oscar and Tiffany tidied up the house. The first thing the man did was to take away the boards that had been used to board up the windows and fix the doors, which had fallen apart. Tiffany got to work scrubbing the floors and windows. After removing the old curtains, she poured water into a basin and prepared to wash. But Oscar stopped her. You shouldn't have such old curtains in the house, Tiffany. So what am I going to do without curtains? We'll put up new ones, Oscar said confidently. Where are we going to get them? Wondered the woman. If we look hard enough, we'll find them, said the forester in a mysterious tone. Tiffany shrugged her shoulders. The day was drawing to a close. Tiffany had already boiled the potatoes, cut the sausage, and opened a can of stew. Your son was very thoughtful, not daring to leave him in the woods without food, Oscar said, but he immediately regretted it. Tiffany grew sad again, thinking. Yes, that's the way it is, raising my only son. You spare nothing for him, and he takes you to the woods, to a cold hut, she sighed. Don't worry so much, Tiffany. People live everywhere, and you're your own here. This is your homeland. The Karelian forest. It has some kind of ancestral memory, protects those who were born and grew up under its pines. Everything will be all right. I know, the man smiled. Tiffany thought. What brings him here? He's certainly not from around here. Tiffany and Oscar became friends. The woodsman visited the woman every day, helping her with chores. Oscar fixed furniture that Tiffany remembered from when she was a little girl. He brought water, helped with firewood. Tiffany fed him a delicious lunch. I saw lights on in some of the houses, people living. I guess they're not leaving, she asked Oscar one day. They are. There are 10 houses left from the whole village, he replied. Mostly the ones the children don't need, and the lonely old people. What do they do here? Who keeps cattle? The vegetable garden feeds them. They go to the forest to gather berries and mushrooms. They catch fish in the lake, then sell them in town. And there's nothing else to do here. Televisions aren't always on. Do they have televisions in the houses? Tiffany got excited. She was bored alone. She was also bored with the soap operas she liked to watch in the city in the evenings. Yes, but the connection sometimes goes down, especially in the winter. Tiffany suddenly got up from the table and went to the wardrobe. There were things that Miles had hastily thrown into bags. She found among them her card, which was to be used to pay the woman's work and pension. Here she handed the card to the forester. "This is my card." "What is it?" The man didn't understand. "I beg you, let's go to the shop and buy me a TV set." "Please," she asked, her palms folded across her chest. Oscar thought for a moment. The nearest shop was 80 kilometers away. It would take all day to get there and back. But Tiffany looked at him with such pleading eyes that he couldn't refuse her. "All right, we'll take my car tomorrow," the man agreed. Tiffany smiled happily. She was growing to like this strong man with such a familiar name. He reminded her very much of her father. 2 months passed, summer came. One warm evening, Oscar and Tiffany were having tea in the yard. The forester had made a small table. Tiffany tied a tablecloth on it. The trees swayed quietly around them, enjoying the pleasant company and tranquility. The woman suddenly thought that nothing ever just happens. Perhaps she should have come back here a long time ago, she wondered to herself. She liked preparing the vegetable garden for planting. She liked setting up the house, making it cozy. Tiffany, Oscar said to her, "You and I are both old. We live here together and we don't seem to get bored." "What's there to be bored about?" "I'll plant a vegetable garden soon and then I'll take care of it," Tiffany told him. "Yes, a vegetable garden is certainly something to do. But that's not what I meant." "Well, Tiffany, let's live together." The woman looked at Oscar in surprise. In his kind eyes there was so much hope, warmth, life experience. "We're hardly ever apart, Oscar. I mean, let's live together, run the household, and watch your TV series in the evenings." He looked so touching in his uncertainty that Tiffany couldn't stand it and held out her hand to him. "Come on, Oscar. It really is more fun together." Without hiding his joy, the man put his arms around Tiffany, held her tightly against him, and stroked her gray hair. One day, returning from the forest, Oscar brought a small fawn into the house. The animal was wounded and looked weak, almost lifeless. "What's wrong with it, Oscar?" Tiffany asked, putting aside the basin of laundry. "He's trapped, the little fellow. I guess the poachers were at it again. I had to rescue the little lynx." "Wow, a lynx. He's healthier than a big cat," said Oscar. "Bring the first aid kit, please." He treated the wound on the lynx's leg, applied a bandage with ointment, and calmed the animal down. "He'll stay with us for a while and then we'll see." An old dog box was re-equipped for the lynx. We had to renew the boards and make an enclosure out of metal mesh. The lynx was named Rex. This was the name of the previous owner of the box. But he was a dog, not a wild cat. The pet was very affectionate, licking Tiffany's hand as she stroked and bandaged him. A few days later, Oscar returned with a large box. There were a dozen chickens in it. "That's not nothing," he said proudly, showing Tiffany the chickens lurking at the bottom of the carton. "Now we'll always have fresh eggs." "Oh my God, Oscar, where are we going to keep them?" Tiffany spluttered. "It's not a problem. Tomorrow morning I'll start building a chicken coop, and then I'll build a stable. We'll have a cow, goats, geese, piglets. We'll have our own farm." Tiffany only shook her head, smiling and enjoying Oscar's thriftiness. It was not a problem for him to get the wood to build buildings. That's why Oscar decided not to be petty. And in just a month, not only the barn, the chicken coop and the pen for geese and ducks, but also a new bathhouse grew in the yard of the house. Tiffany was overjoyed when the first smoke appeared from the chimney. "In time, we'll renovate the house," Oscar promised. "As long as I have the strength, I'll do it all." Once a month, Tiffany and Oscar drove into town to withdraw money from their cards and get Oscar's salary. At the same time, they would stop by the market and sell eggs, milk, and poultry to the vendors. The price was not high, but they did not want to trade themselves. They had to go back and do farming. Having made the necessary purchases, they would go home. One day on their way back, they noticed a car on a forest road. "It's not ours, some tourists, probably," Oscar suggested and pulled up next to the unfamiliar car. "Hello. Do you need any help?" "Good evening." A man in his 40s approached Oscar. "My car broke down. No matter how hard I try, it won't start." "Let me have a look," the forester offered. He looked under the bonnet of the foreign car, touched and moved something. "It's bad, it needs repair," said Oscar. "Where is there to repair?" asked the man. "I looked on the navigator. There are no settlements nearby." Two boys of about 8 or 10 years old jumped out of the strange man's car. They were followed by a woman. Oscar looked at the family and said decisively, "Let's go to our place. Tomorrow morning I'll take you to the service. There's a cable." The men hooked the foreign car with the cable, and everyone settled down. Oscar dragged the broken car to the village. "Here we are," he said. And Tiffany, inviting the guests in, added, "Come inside." She led the woman and her children inside. It turned out they had traveled a long way. "We've wanted to see the local sights for a long time, but the car was a little slow," the woman said. "My name is Natalie, and these are our sons Miles and Nicholas." The boys sat down near the enclosure with a lynx, looking at it in surprise. Everything in the house and in the yard seemed strange. In the evening, everyone gathered round the table outside. Oscar and Natalie's husband Travis grilled meat on the barbecue, and the women prepared vegetables and herbs. For such an occasion, Oscar got a bottle of moonshine from somewhere. To getting acquainted to meeting. "Here's to your car being repaired quickly," he said, pouring it into shot glasses. Everyone present supported him. The evening was wonderful. Natalie put the children to bed in the house. They barely made it to bed. The hosts and guests all sat around talking, drinking fragrant tea with forest herbs. And the next day, Travis's car was taken to the service center. It turned out that it would be ready only the next day, and the men returned to Oscar and Tiffany's house. The guests had brightened up the homeowners' lives. All day the boys tended to the animals, fed carrots to the rabbits, carried hay for the cow and collected eggs in the henhouse, and then drank steamed milk. Travis and Oscar chopped wood and stacked it in a neat stack, and the women cooked meals. In the evening, everyone went to the lake, swam and boated, and when they returned, a real bathhouse was waiting for them. It was a wonderful weekend. "Thank you," the guests thanked the hospitable hosts. "We could not even imagine that this is such a wonderful holiday, and we really enjoyed it." "Come back again," Oscar said, shaking Travis' hand in farewell. "You bet we will, and we'll bring our friends with us," he promised, as the car with the new friends drove off down the street. Oscar said to Tiffany, "I think it's time to start building guest houses." All summer, Tiffany worked in the vegetable garden, harvesting crops and making preparations for the winter. Oscar got serious about building an addition to the house. He enjoyed having visitors, and in his heart he hoped that Travis would keep his promise and come on holiday to visit them. The man and woman went to the woods to pick berries and mushrooms, made jam and pickled vegetables, and in the long winter Tiffany knitted warm socks, mittens, and other things from the rabbit's wool. So the winter flew by, followed by spring. The elderly couple's household gradually expanded, and the chores became more troublesome. One evening they were finishing digging a plot of land for planting potatoes, when suddenly a few cars drove up to the house one after another. "Who's that, Oscar?" Tiffany wondered. "Let's see," replied her husband, and went to the gate. Travis walked towards him. "Well done, master," he shouted when he saw Oscar. "How are you? Are you well?" "Healthy, thank God," he said. "Tiffany, look who's here." The men hugged each other, happy to see each other. "Will you take me in? I want to stay for a week, go fishing, walk in the woods, just relax," Travis asked. "Why do you ask? We are only glad to have such guests." Oscar smiled, patting his friend on the shoulder. "But you see, I didn't come alone. "How many of you are there?" asked the owner. "Is this all of you coming to our place?" He pointed to the cars. "Yeah, we'll sort it out among the guests." People started pouring out of the cars. Men, women, children. And before Tiffany could catch her breath, she was surrounded by young women, shaking hands and calling out their names, asking her where to take her things and her groceries. "To the house, girls, to the house," Tiffany replied, confused. Gradually, things calmed down and there was no more fuss. The women began to prepare the food, and the men set up some tents in the yard. What clever people, Tiffany thought. The children had beds in the house and the adults were in the yard. The noise, the fun, the joy of the children's voices settled into Tiffany and Oscar's previously quiet home for a week. The children enjoyed feeding the animals, going to the lake with their parents, and playing outside. The women helped Tiffany, even though she refused to help. After all, people were here on holiday. The men had plenty to do all day long, and they enjoyed it all because of the variety. Oscar even took the guests hunting. And how they enjoyed fishing. Tiffany collected gifts for the guests: socks and mittens made of rabbit wool, jam made of wild berries, pickled and salted mushrooms, and smoked fish caught by the guests themselves. For a long time, the hosts hugged and could not part with their guests. They had become so close during that week, and when the townspeople left, Tiffany found money and a card under the tablecloth in the room, wishing them well and hoping they would meet again. "So we've made our first money on our farm," Oscar smiled happily. He felt that soon there would be new guests in the house, and he was not mistaken. A week later, another group of 3 families arrived. "Travis told me you guys have a great holiday here," said a man named Scott. "It's a good holiday. Come on in the yard," Oscar said. "Rumors abound, but good things come to good." A few years flew by unnoticed. Now, from May to September, tourists from different cities came to visit Tiffany and Oscar, some for a day or two, and some for a week. Oscar had built several summer houses, bought 2 boats, and installed a drip irrigation system. People from megalopolises and noisy cities liked to relax surrounded by wild, untouched nature. The hosts did not demand payment for accommodation and did not set any rates. After all, the guests helped them in many ways. But the tourists always left money, which Oscar invested in new buildings, the purchase of fodder for cattle and other necessary things. That day they were waiting for the next guests. "Look, someone is coming," Oscar shouted to the woman. "I think it's ours." A black Jeep stopped at the gate, and a man got out. He looked with surprise at the good house with beautiful carved plait bands, at the strange man, at the links in the enclosure. "Don't you recognize him?" "My son is here," Tiffany said quietly, shielding her eyes from the sun with her hand. She took a few steps forward and smiled, bowing her head. "Hello, son." "Hello." Walter's legs gave out at the sight of his mother, healthy, beautiful, and cheerful. He hugged his mother and sobbed, stroking her head. Tiffany softly spoke the words that Oscar had once said to her. "This is our homeland here, son, the Maine woods. It somehow keeps the memory of our ancestors alive, protects those who were born and raised beneath its pines. It's going to be okay. I know it will."